Cool. Folks, let's do the quick little recap. As I said, okay, we are just in the thick of it, all right? And it's just going to keep on keeping on, and it's going to keep on going fast. And so that's exactly what I want you to expect for tonight, tomorrow night, and the next night is fast. I will make one other statement before I jump into this. I have edited 2 more of the videos. The problem is, if you can tell, I have a different background. I am currently at my property in Georgia, and I have 2 laptops that I'm using to edit all these things and do them. However, these laptops are not the same as my, I bought a gaming PC specifically to render these videos and upload them. I don't have that one with me. So these videos are taking like 5 hours to render and 13 hours to upload. So they are coming, but what I will do in the interim is I will provide links for you to watch the completely unedited version from Zoom. They all exist where I can share a link with you, and so you will just have to, you know, fish around in it, but it does exist. So I can share those links in GroupMe tonight, and you can have access to everything up till today, and then the cleaner, prettier versions will hit YouTube, you know, within the next 5 days or so. So they are coming, but I still have them where I can give them to you so you can get all the material. So nobody panic. They're just not as pretty. Okay, they're not as straightforward. Yeah, and that's what I was thinking. I don't want you to have to like wait, you know, a week to start reviewing some of these things. So I will put the links tonight to every single video, but understand that, you know, you may see some of your faces in these videos because I edit those out for the way that it records, you know, and comes through Zoom. If I'm not sharing my screen, sometimes it records just me. Sometimes it records like everything that you're seeing right now with all the people. So, you know, just, you know, it's okay. But that is not a public facing in any way, shape, and form. It's just only y'all can see that after I provide a link that has an access code to get into it. So just keep that in mind. Nobody panic. So let's circle back around. Okay, we talked about agency, and agency is an extremely important and an extremely testable concept. And so I threw a lot of different words at you and some terminology, and sometimes terminology is a make or break for agency. Okay. And so let me just give you some examples, or better yet, you answer some questions for me. What do we call our person that we are representing?
Principal.
Both of those, principal and client. And what do we call everybody else?
Customer.
A customer. And so we understand that if you see the word client in a question, you automatically know that you're representing them, or at least your firm is. If you see the word customer in a question, you automatically know they're not our person. Those are very powerful words. Well, furthermore, we got into, you know, things like buyer's agent. Well, buyer's agent always works for a buyer. Seller's agent always works for their seller. Listing agent always works for who?
The seller.
The seller. And what about a selling agent? What can you tell me about that term, selling agent?
Depends.
Depends. It's a dangerous term. It is never strong enough. Say it again.
Selling agent will be the procuring cause.
Yeah, that's a good word to throw in the mix. They are arguably the procuring cause, right? The person who brought the buyer. A procuring cause doctrine is basically you sparked the chain of events that led to this buyer being produced. And so we'll probably use that terminology some more in a little bit. But basically, you are assisting a buyer. That's all it tells you. You brought a buyer, you're assisting a buyer, you're working with a buyer. But it does not tell you who you're working for. Remember, we have to have an agency agreement that shows who we work for. And so you may be assisting a buyer as a seller sub-agent, which means you work for who?
Seller sub-agent.
Mm-hmm.
The seller.
The seller. Or you may be assisting a buyer as a buyer's agent, which means you work for who?
The buyer.
The buyer. And you got to pay very careful attention in these different ways that these test questions will manifest. Now, we went on and talked about dual agency. Folks, what is the definition of dual agency?
The firm represents the buyer and the seller.
In one transaction.
There you go. There you go. Let's combine those two. You've always got to say in the same transaction, because a firm that represents buyers and sellers is not dual agency. That's just a firm that chooses to work with both. But it has to be in that very same transaction. And if you are acting as a dual agent, what can you do?
Nothing.
Nothing. You are worthless. You are just there to look pretty. You can't do nothing because you owe loyalties to both, which basically makes you worthless. Now, what is it when we have this special type of dual agency that allows some brokers to go for blood?
Designated dual agency.
Designated dual agency. But folks, if it just says this firm has the buyer, that same firm has the seller, that's dual, answer the question like you're worthless. They would have to give you more context or clearly state that you are doing designated for it to be that go for blood territory. I will also warn you, don't call that exclusive. Exclusive means we are only looking after you. But remember, that's about the agent. The agent is not only looking after anybody. Individual licensees have been assigned to look after the best interest. So it acts like exclusive representation, but it's still a type of dual agency. Everybody okay with everything I've just said in this little recap? Now, good deal. One of the big confusions that a lot of y'all put in the chats or emailed me, and let's just talk about it right now, is the working with real estate agents disclosure. Now, every state has disclosure rules. That was one of the big things that came from that lawsuit that I told you about last week. But when we're focusing on, North Carolina's and the trigger for the working with the real estate agents disclosure, I want you to think of it this way. Remember, I told you first and foremost, it is only required in what type of transactions? This WWREA disclosure.
Selling.
Sales transactions. Somebody potentially buying, somebody potentially selling. It could be residential or commercial, meaning it's not technically or legally required to give an agency disclosure to a prospective tenant, or to give one as a property manager representing a property owner. If somebody's potentially a buyer or potentially a seller, they would need to get one. And so I want you to think of this. If you are not representing anybody that would provide any kind of conflict of interest, and you were to meet a potential buyer, meet a potential seller, what is the trigger for providing that working with a real estate agent's disclosure?
First substantial contact.
First substantial contact. And what does that mean?
Disclosure of confidential information.
There you go.
Yeah.
Anytime the conversation starts to go into confidential territory. And so
How did we word that one more time?
First substantial contact. And so the way that we generally speak of it is like PTM, right? Price, terms, motivation. Anytime somebody begins to start having conversations with you that information could hurt them in a negotiation. If we could use it in, I have to close within 30 days. I have $10,000 or $10 million. I guess 10,000 is enough to buy a house. Anything that would be very specific. I'm going through a nasty divorce. If you could use it against them and they start to tell you, you got to stop them. And you got to provide this written disclosure, okay? And you review it with them. The way the rules are written are very specific. It is a written disclosure, and you do have to review it with them and give them a copy after the fact. So that is the trigger for, in general, if you're meeting a potential buyer or potential seller. First substantial contact. And I will caution you again, sorry, I'm trying to send a message in the chat real quick. So I will caution you again that they're not going to test you on best practice. That's not the point of this class. So it's not hand it to them as soon as you meet somebody. No, that's not what the test questions are going to ask you. It's going to say, what is the deadline? When is the last opportunity? When should you? And the trigger is that first substantial contact. So that's how you're going to answer the vast majority of the questions. Sales transactions, potential buyers and sellers, residential or commercial, at the time the conversation starts going to confidential information. Stop them, explain it to them, review it to them, right? It's a written disclosure, and then give them a copy of it. Now, the other one that y'all were getting a little confused on is very specific. If you already have loyalties specifically to a buyer, you are already a buyer's agent. Okay, Jacob's my buyer. And he calls me up and he says, Seth, I want to see this for sale by owner. And Tim is the for sale by owner. Well, folks, I'm not going to be able to get access to Tim's house without calling him. So the second I call Tim the seller, I would have to disclose at initial contact, hey, I am representing a buyer client who is interested in your house. If you are already representing a buyer and you are communicating with a seller or a seller's agent in regard to a house that your buyer is interested in, it is initial contact. Initial contact. And the reason is because of the potential conflict of interest that could arise. Folks, you could legally and lawfully be on the same team as that seller if you were calling to tell them that you were acting as a seller subagent. But because you already have the opposite team, you have to tell them, I'm not on your team the second you start talking to them. Does that make sense? Those are the big triggers there. For almost every scenario dealing with sales, it's first substantial contact that's the trigger. But when you represent a buyer specifically and you are reaching out to a seller or a seller's agent for a property your buyer has interest in, automatic conflict of interest, initial contact is the timing. Everybody good? Good deal.
So I think I got those two mixed up earlier when I was studying and practicing some of the tests.
And it's a hard concept, folks. I mean, it's a really hard concept because, I mean, there's just this powerful law and rule. And they're like, but, which is where I also caution you. We have very few absolutes from a testable point of view. Very few. I'm not going to say none, but very few absolutes. I mean, you know, just to reiterate, I mean, if we owe our client old car, well, obedience, follow their lawful, willful instructions, it's confidentiality, we owe them these things. But if there's a material fact, we say, go to HE double hockey sticks. We got to tell the rest of the world. Very few absolutes in this entirety of this curriculum. Not saying none, but very few. So the other thing that we got into is the agency contracts. Now, one of the things we discussed before we actually looked into the agency contract is the way that these agency agreements could end. Which ways can our agency agreements come to an end?
Mutual agreement.
Mutual agreement, absolutely. That'll terminate every single, yep.
Death, completion, breach of contract, or whatever it's called when it's fulfilled, like you
completion of purpose. Yeah, let's talk about a couple of these, okay? Mutual agreement will kill every single contract in the world, including agency agreements. Fulfillment of purpose. If you hired me to sell your house and I sold it and you paid me, we're done. If you hired me to help you buy a house and I helped you buy one and you paid me, we're done. But let's talk about the death one because there's some confusion in the GroupMe chat on that one as well. And so death of a party would kill an agency contract. Well, the parties to an agency contract, let's say a listing agreement, seller and agent, which is the firm. And so there's a little bit of confusion. Folks, a firm can die. Not the same way that you or I could die, but if the firm went belly up, if they dissolved their entity, if they lost their BIC, if they, lost their qualifying broker, it is possible for a firm to quote unquote die. And so if you had an agreement between, Tim the seller and Coldwell Banker shut its doors and closed the corporation down, that agency agreement is dead. Don't think that a firm can't die, but what y'all were getting caught up on, if Adriana was a affiliated licensee under Coldwell Banker and had that listing agreement with Tim and Adriana dies, yeah, Coldwell Banker is still alive. So death of an individual licensee wouldn't kill an agency agreement with a firm. Does that make sense? But remember,
Yes.
There is a time where death of an individual licensee would kill that agency agreement. When is that?
If they are so if they're working for a sole proprietorship.
If they are a sole proprietorship, because then they are it. It is running through their broker's license. And so if they die, then it's dead. Is that making a little more sense now?
Yeah, when I commented that in the group me, I just misread and misunderstood the question.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and please understand, folks, these are very confusing concepts. I mean, they really are, which is why I keep calling this the doozy chapters. This is the real deal. I mean, it gets real confusing real quick because there's these itty bitty little differences that changes the entirety of the question. Right? If you're answering a question about a full broker versus a provisional broker, that's an extremely different question. If you're answering a question about a firm versus a sole proprietorship, that's a completely different question. Hell, if you're answering a question about a one-person firm versus a 50-person firm, that could potentially be a very different question. So you've got to pay attention to all the nuances within the questions. So let me also give you the last little recap before we ended the night on our last class night, okay? We started talking about listing agreements specifically. We're going to talk about buyer agency agreements tonight. There were 3 types of listing agreements we discussed. What were they? Tell me one, then let's talk about it.
Open,
Open. Let's stop there. What is an open listing agreement?
The seller will have multiple broker firms represent them.
There you go. They're going to hire multiple people, just like an open relationship, to try to do this thing they need, find them a buyer. And if any of those people find them a buyer, that person will get paid, but only that person will get paid, the one that actually brings them the buyer. What's the other very important part of that?
They reserve the right to find a buyer for themselves, and if they do, they don't have to pay anybody.
There you go. In that open listing agreement, they've hired multiple firms, all of them attempting to find a buyer, and then if any of those brokers finds them a buyer, they will get paid. However, the seller has reserved the right to find their own buyer and say, I'm not paying any of you nothing because I took care of it myself. Absolutely. Open listing agreement. Name another one.
Exclusive agency listing.
Exclusive agency listing agreement. Tell me about that one.
The client cannot have but one listing agent
There you go.
or one firm to represent them.
There's that word exclusive, right? Just like a relationship, it's just me and you, okay? Exclusive. And so they've hired one firm to do the marketing efforts to get their property sold. Now understand that we are going to be marketing it to cooperating firms. And so if any broker, because that'd be through our efforts, brings a buyer, we're going to get paid because we typically are offering that compensation. But what's the other unique thing about exclusive agency?
Is it an exclusive agency? They still reserve the right to
They
sell?
still, yet again, just like open, the seller still reserves the right to sell it themselves and not pay any broker anything. Yeah, they only hired you to do the marketing professionally for them, but they never promised to not find their own buyer and not pay you for that regard. So they could still find their own buyer and not pay you nothing. That is the exclusive agency. What's the last one?
Exclusive right to sell.
Exclusive right to sell, and tell me about that one.
It means that the realtor or broker has the exclusive right to sell the property, meaning that no matter where the buyer comes from, that firm, that realtor is getting paid.
There you go. So yet again, they have hired one firm and one firm exclusively. We're going to market it like normal, but at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter where the buyer comes from because the seller does not have the right to sell it themselves anymore. If they find their own buyer, they still have to pay us. If we find the buyer, they have to pay us. If a cooperating broker finds the buyer, they have to pay us. No matter where this buyer comes from, they have to pay us. And that's where this verbiage, procurement of a ready, willing, and able buyer at terms acceptable to the seller, comes into play. As long as that happens, we have technically, legally done our job. Now, for an enforcement purpose, we really only consider that, our biggest part of our job when they try to breach contract, when they refuse to sell, when they, do these other things. Because ultimately our job, we will go further and get it to closing. But be aware on the test that if they ask you, if you've done this, have you done your job in the exclusive right to sell listing agreement? Yeah. If you procured a ready, willing, and able buyer at terms acceptable to the seller. So we looked at the listing agreement and I went through and I told you some of the big provisions. And so I'll reiterate one other thing before we move into new slides and the buyer agency agreement. I told you in North Carolina there are 4 required things that have to be present in every written agency agreement. Now, I'm not going to, try to force you to remember that because that's something that we didn't go into crazy detail on yet. But the 4 things are the definite termination date, signature of all the parties, the non-discrimination provision, and the individual broker's license number. Ironically enough, folks, I'm going to say this out loud. It's not the firm's license number, as odd as that sounds. It is the individual subagent who is signing on behalf of the firm. That licensee's license number is required. Yeah, we put the firm's number on there too, but the one that's required by rule is the individual broker's license number.
Can you repeat those one more time, please?
Yeah. Signatures of all the parties, definite termination date, non-discrimination provision that, the firm will act without regard to race, color, religion, sex, national origin, and then the individual broker's license number. So, as I've kind of articulated to you now, there are times where you may not actually go to closing and you could still be entitled to compensation. Like I told you, if we had a listing agreement, we found a ready, willing, and able buyer, definitely ready, willing, and able. Remember we talked about those. They have to be pre-approved. They have to have made an offer. They actually have to want the property. And it has to be terms acceptable to the seller. The seller is not obligated to sell it. But if they elect not to and they don't want to move forward, we've still earned our fee. They still owe us money because we did the job. Now, when we're dealing with listing a house, I told you the way that this kind of flows. We charge the seller a commission. And of that commission, we will turn around and say, okay, well, here's how we're going to share it. And so we could keep it all in-house if we end up being a dual agent, meaning, let's say we charge 6%, all 6% is going to go to our firm and just be split between different licensees. We could offer compensation in a co-brokered relationship, which is very common. That's what the multiple listing service is utilized for. I'm keeping this much, but I'm offering this much to you. If you bring me a buyer, I will pay you this much. It's called a co-broker deal. Now, remember what I told you as we got into these agency conversations. If we are in a co-broker deal, what would never arise? Yeah, we're overthinking it. If we are in a co-broker deal, what would never arise?
Dual agency.
Dual agency. Because dual agency is an in-house transaction only. ABC has the buyer, ABC has the seller in the same transaction. If we've got ABC Realty with the seller and XYZ Realty with the buyer, what do we have? Besides being co-brokered, what kind of relationship and here and what kind of relationship here?
You got a seller relationship and a buyer relationship.
Yeah, but what word can we use? Exclusive. Exclusive representation, right? Because ABC only cares about this person. XYZ only cares about this person. When we say exclusive, that means, it doesn't mean that the other party's unrepresented. We just don't give a crap about them. Because they are a customer to us. Everybody okay with that? Now, the other way that sometimes these compensations get shared can be referral fees. We can do in-state referrals. We can do out-of-state referrals. We can't practice brokerage. Your license, when you get it, is only good for the state of North Carolina. It is not good for any other state, but we can send referrals to other states. So I've done that in the past. I sent somebody to Virginia a couple years ago, and they send you a referral fee. So that's, the different ways that this can happen. Now, when we're dealing with a buyer's agent, okay, we're going to switch gears here. We've been talking about listing agent, and we've been talking about listing agreements. I want to talk about the buyer's agent. I want to show you the buyer agency agreement. Now, the buyer agency agreement is not nearly as long as the listing agreement, and a lot of the provisions are extremely similar. Let me pull this up here. So in the listing agreement, we will state, well, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, we're going to charge you X amount. And then of that, we may be sharing with a cooperating brokerage firm. On the buyer agency agreement, the compensation looks a little bit different. We would state, well, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, here's how much we anticipate making as your buyer's agent. And then it goes on to tell them, hey, we're going to seek to get that compensation from a listing firm or from a seller first. But if they're not willing to pay us, we may turn to you in order to be compensated. That's kind of the difference there.
I'm sorry, wait, say that one more time.
On the buyer agency agreement, I'm about to show it to you too. On the buyer agency agreement, it says, here's how much we anticipate to make as the buyer's agent. And then it goes on to say, well, this amount of money, we're going to seek to get it from the seller or the seller's agent first by way of cooperating compensation. But if they don't offer us any compensation or if they refuse to pay us, we may turn to you as the buyer and say, you have to pay us for our services. It does happen. Let me show you. What you got, Adriana?
So this real estate brokerage fee is it's like a specific fee, or it's like a percentage of the sale?
Yeah, we're going to talk about the actual math that goes with it in just a second. It could be either. Typically, these fees are a percentage of the sales price, but they could also be a flat rate as well. It could just be that, like, hey, we'll do it for $6,000, or, hey, we'll do it for 3%. There's no rule. It would just have to be clearly identified what we're being compensated.
So if the seller if the other agent don't share the broker's fee, then you can include some closing costs for the buyer to pay. Is that right?
If the listing firm does not share compensation with you, could we ask the buyer to pay it? Is that what your question is?
Yes.
Yes, that's exactly what we would do. Yeah, and I'm about to show it to you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Everybody see this buyer agency agreement? So just like the listing agreement, it starts off the same way, okay? This buyer agency agreement is entered into between blank as buyer and blank as firm. Then it goes on to say the agent who signs this will be primarily looking after you, but understand everybody within the firm is potentially assigned to you as well, just like it said before. Now, remember what I told you. We use this word exclusive in two different contexts. Okay, there is the context of them to us and the context of us to them. When we're looking at the agency agreements like this one and like the listing agreement, that word exclusive means them to us, which means when they sign this exclusive buyer agency agreement, what does that mean for them?
That they can't sign with anyone else.
That they can't sign with anyone else. That's exactly right. Now, remember the other context was us to them. And every single relationship starts out as exclusive. But it may not stay that way if they authorize dual agency, remember? Because let's say that Misty hires me, Misty's a buyer, and we sign this exclusive buyer agency agreement. That means Misty can't have anybody other than me and my firm. But if Misty authorizes dual agency, I don't have to remain exclusive to her. I'll start off that way, but as soon as dual agency arises, Misty and I are no longer exclusive, are we? See how that works? So it's the same word, same meaning, two different contexts. Them to us, us to them. So this is that same little provision saying, okay, well, you're not working with anybody else because you're entering into this exclusive one and that you've already seen the working with the real estate agent's disclosure. Which part, Jacob? Can't hear you. You're muted.
I said, I don't know. I just kind of lost today. Everything sounds jumbled, and I don't know what is talking about what. Like, I hear the words, I just don't know what exactly is talking about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but it can easily get jumbled. So let me just reiterate. When you see exclusive on this agency agreement, that is telling them that they cannot have another buyer agent.
Telling the
The buyer, yep, the buyer client, that they have now agreed, if they sign this, to work with us and only us, our firm and only our firm. They cannot have a relationship with another firm during the terms of this agreement.
Okay. And what was that other part about dual agency?
So if I was to, I use the example of Misty. If Misty hires me and we come to this relationship with an exclusive buyer agency agreement, Misty is promising that she's not going to have another buyer agent because this is exclusive. And what's going to happen, remember, is we're going to have a conversation about whether dual agency is permitted or not. And we looked at this last week with the listing agreement. It looks the exact same here. So Misty, in theory, could say, okay, yes, dual agency is okay. But even though she has authorized dual to arise, I'm still giving her exclusive representation. Now, in this context of exclusive, I'm saying my firm only cares about her well-being. But the second that dual agency arises, she's not getting exclusive representation from us anymore. Because now we care about Misty and the seller. But she's still exclusive to us. What you got, Sam?
So if Misty signs this exclusive buyer's agreement and then dual agency does arise in the future, do we sign a new agreement or does this one just keep going?
Yeah, this one, she's giving us authorization to act as a dual agent right here. All Misty has to do is initial this and says, yes, Seth, I'm okay with dual arising. And then furthermore, she'd say, of dual, do I want designated? So it's all outlined on here, and so we don't need a new agreement. Now, remember what I said, though. Let's just see what you remember from last week. If Misty and I are entering into this buyer agency agreement, and instead of authorizing dual, she says, no, Seth, I want y'all to be exclusive to me as well. She's going to initial here saying, I want exclusive representation only. As a buyer representing by us now in this exclusive relationship, what does that mean for her?
It means that she can't buy anything that your firm has listed.
There you go. I cannot take her to go see any listings my firm has because that would be dual agency. Now, can Misty change her mind? Yes. When Misty falls in love with 123 Main Street, and I'm saying, sorry, Misty, you want exclusive representation. And that's listed by our firm. Misty can say, okay, well, I changed my mind. And so Misty could come in here and put a strike through and change this and say, okay, yep, dual agency is fine now. But we'd have to get consent before we took her to go see it.
Quick question.
Uh-huh.
Does she have to, at that point, like if she changes her mind, do we need her to for her initials and a new date or no?
Yeah, so it would need to be formally changed. It would need to be formally changed, which could be a strike through and then initialing and dating the change of all parties. There's also what we call an amendment that we could use that say, okay, we have changed this on this agreement. It would need to be done formally. Now, I'm going to tell you all a really advanced subject here, and it makes me sick to my stomach to tell you this, and I'll tell you why after I teach it to you. And then I'll get your question, Jacob. When we are dealing with dual agency, we can't do dual agency without what? There's certain terminology I used last week. You can't have dual agency without blank and blank blank.
Authorization.
Authorization, but there's a little more specific words that I wanted to hear.
Disclosure?
Let me help you out. Informed and written consent. Informed and written consent. You would have had to explain what dual agency means. They would have to be aware of it. And then they would have to give you written consent to act as a dual agent. This is where you get this written consent. Now, here's the big old mountain topic that I'm about to give you. Okay, this is a thing. Folks, are there times where we are representing a buyer without a written buyer agency agreement?
Yes.
Yes. We can have an oral buyer agency agreement up until what point?
Who you start talking about?
An offer.
An offer. It has to be reduced to a written buyer agency agreement no later than a presentation of an offer. And so the reason I'm bringing this up, folks, yes, the rule is informed and written consent. However, it is not possible to get written consent typically from somebody who's only acting in an oral capacity. So if you were acting as an oral buyer agency, you would need at least oral consent to dual agency while that relationship was oral. But at the time that you had to reduce this to a written buyer agency agreement, you would need that consent to dual in writing as well. The reason why it makes me sick to my stomach to teach you this concept is the Real Estate Commission changed their stance on this recently. And so I'm just going to tell you the new thing, but it's still irritating. Understand that that's only for the buyer, because seller's agreements have to be in writing from the word go. And so if the seller has not given written consent to dual agency, then you cannot take that oral buyer client to see it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And we're going to talk some more about it as time goes on. What you got, Jacob?
So if you're in a situation where, say you're representing me and I say, no, I don't want dual agency. I only say I only, I trust it if I don't have dual agency, whatever. Right. And then say I find another house that I love, that in order for you to show me, it would have to be dual agency. And I say, no, I still don't feel comfortable doing dual agency, but I want that home. At which point, is that something that can potentially give the buyer the ability to hire a different realtor from another firm to show them that property so that they can purchase?
Nothing just magically supersedes our exclusivity in this agreement. Understand that right now. So really and truthfully, this would just come down to a conversation. So the conversation would be, well, Jacob, if you want that house, you're either going to have to allow me to do dual agency, or we could sever our relationship and I could send you to another brokerage firm and have them represent you. But you can't automatically just hire somebody because there's nothing in this agreement that gives you an out because, oh, I like that house a lot and I want it and I have to have it. You don't get an out just because of that. Could we mutually agree to end our relationship so you could go unrepresented or so you could work with a different firm? Sure, but I don't have to let you out of it. So it could be sucks to suck, Chuck. If you want to put an offer in through me, we're going to do dual agency, or you're just going to have to wait until the agreement. So, but that is not something that's really going to show up to that level on the test, because that is just such an oddly, specific real world scenario.
Yeah, I figured that wouldn't show up on the test. It was just for my own curiosity.
Yeah.
It was trying to fully understand.
Yeah, you couldn't just go and do it, but we would have to have a conversation about, well, what do we do next, and try to figure that out. Yeah. So let me scroll back up to the top of this because, we kind of had some conversations there. The buyer agency agreement is not too dissimilar, but of course, we do need to look at the compensation piece, okay? Understand, too, that I told you destruction of the property would kill which agency contracts?
Seller.
Sell.
Listing agreements? And?
Like
Buyer
leasing agreements as well, right?
Not buyer agency agreements. What'd you say, Jacob?
Leasing.
Be more specific.
The equivalent of the seller's side, not the
I'll help you out.
words, man.
Property management agreement.
Yes.
Property management agreement. Folks, those are property specific. Property management agreement, I've agreed to manage a specific property. A listing agreement, I've agreed to market and sell a specific property. Buyer agency agreements, as I told you before, they're not property specific. Typically, You say residential or commercial or other, general location. And so in the real world, when I fill this out, I would say Wake County and surrounding area and residential. That's all I'd say. So if you were under contract to buy a house and that house burns to the ground, our buyer agency agreement is alive and well, because we can do what? Just go find you a new house. So remember that. Destruction of the property does not kill a buyer agency agreement because it is general. It's vague typically. Now, this does have a term of the agreement. And so I told you in an earlier application question, in general, when you complete the purpose, an agency agreement will end. All contracts will. But I also mentioned that buyer agency agreements are unique because you could have this going in perpetuity for a period of time and it not be, dependent on closing on a piece of property. And that's what these two options are here. For buyers who intend to purchase a single property, this agreement shall terminate when buyer acquires real property of the type described in paragraph 1 or 11:59 p.m. on whatever date. So if time runs out, it would die. If you help them buy a property, it would die, right? It's done. It's been fulfilled. But this second piece would be utilized, as I said, for like an investor. If you were helping somebody buy 10 homes, does happen, as opposed to having 10 buyer agency agreements. So it's for buyers who may purchase more than one property. This agreement shall terminate at 11:59 p.m. on. Now, most of your test questions are not going to be dealing with that scenario. So don't let it trick you, okay? Go to your default. The default is if you have a buyer agency agreement and you help them buy a house, is your buyer agency agreement dead? Yes. Okay? Yes. Now, here's where I told you the compensation piece is different. Firm acknowledges receipt of a non-refundable retainer fee in the amount of blank. Well, let's start there. A retainer fee is basically upfront monies to do a job. If you've ever needed to hire an attorney, they use retainers. So you call an attorney because you want to sue somebody. They may say, okay, well, I have a retainer of $3,000. So that means you pay them $3,000 up front for them to start working on your case, and they charge a rate of $300 per hour. And they'll basically tell you when all your money is spent, and they say, okay, well, I'm not done, but I've spent all $3,000 you've given me. Give me another $3,000 retainer to keep working on this. Now, we don't do it quite to that extent, but it's the same concept. If you're working as a buyer agent, you're scheduling showings, driving people around, or driving to meet them, using gas money, using resources. It can cost money to show them properties. So it's not common practice, but could you charge a retainer fee? Sure. Which is just an upfront, give me $500 so I know that you're serious about buying. And then you can go on to say that it shall or shall not be credited towards any compensation due the firm under this agreement. What you got, Dora?
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
So when I was a broker, this was kind of hard to get it to go through. A lot of my buyers are like, I don't know about all this. So is it more common now? We're talking like 2019, 2020 for me, but is it more common now? Or, because like I said, I did. That was one of the things that turned me away to not do it full time, because I was like, you know what, I'm spending way too much money. There was a lot of my clients that was over an hour to 2 hour drive, and it was like, hey, fuel costs, right?
It's not more common now in any way, shape, and form, just because, there's so many brokers who are hungry and willing to do it for less. And so, if you're trying to charge them, somebody else may not. But it depends, right? It depends on the buyer. It depends on, the exact circumstances. It depends on how you articulate it. Now, understand the biggest thing that you have to know is it's ultimately up to your firm whether or not they want to do this, right? That's their call. They're not going to let you just go willy-nilly on it, right? Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, this has nothing to do with the brokerage fee.
Mm-hmm. The retainer, it's a separate thing, but that's where we're saying it could be credited towards the compensation due the firm under the agreement, or it shall not be credited. In other words, we're keeping this on top of what we're getting, or this is included in what we anticipated getting, and so we'll basically give it back to you after we come to closing. Either one is acceptable. You would just have to articulate it.
Okay, so this like testable, this part of the retainer fee?
Yeah, knowing that there could be a retainer fee charged by a buyer's agent and what it does, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I'm not going to talk about anything that's not potentially testable, and we don't have time for that. Yeah. So the retainer fee is not going to be a huge portion of your test. Just if you see the word retainer fee for a buyer's agent, it is a thing that could happen. Okay. Now the big portion is, of course, and you'll see it on the slide when I go back. The big portion is commission. And then sometimes they also throw in what's called a success fee. And a success fee is just, a fee that may be paid for completion or getting them under contract. The compensation could be deemed a success fee, right? The brokerage fee that you're anticipating getting. Sometimes you could negotiate fees for getting them under contract in a specific search scenario. That's not going to be incredibly testable in any way, shape, and form. The next couple things are going to be the bigger pieces, all right? So we talked about the listing agreement and how you could earn your compensation and how you charge that. Well, on this one, it says buyer agrees that the firm's fee for services hereunder shall be in the amount of blank. Could be a dollar amount, could be a percentage, could be whatever. And here's where I told you where this starts. Firm shall seek the fee from a cooperating listing firm through the firm's offer of compensation in the MLS or otherwise, or from the seller if there is no listing firm. And the buyer agrees that the firm shall be entitled to receive same in consideration for the firm's services hereunder. In other words, this is what I expect to make, and you agree that I'm entitled to it once I, attempt to collect it. So it's saying we're going to try to get it from the seller and or the listing agent first. Then it goes on to say, if a buyer purchases property where the compensation offered by the listing firm and or the seller is less than the fee, or where no compensation is offered by either the listing firm or the seller, buyer and firm agree that buyer will pay the difference between the fee and the compensation offered unless prohibited by law. Firm shall timely inform buyer if the compensation offered is less than expected. Then I'll read this next part in a second after I give you some clarity here. So this is where I'm going to tie this back into your fiduciary duties under the common law of agency. I told you that you owe them loyalty, and that meant that their needs, wants, and desires come before your own. And I gave you an example, and hopefully this will make you feel a little bit better. The example that I gave you was, if you have a buyer who wants to see 3 homes, one is offering you 5%, one is offering you 2%, one is offering you $1. You cannot refuse to take them to go see any of them. However, you have clearly stated that if you are getting offered less than what you expected to make, and you can't get it from the seller or the seller's agent, you may be looking at them to make up the difference, and that's okay. Everybody good with that statement? Now, the last one is just like it is on the other one. When we're dealing with certain license laws and commission rules in North Carolina, we have these laws and rules that we've kind of touched on briefly. But one of them is a disclosure of compensation. If we're going to be getting more money than we thought we were going to be making because of a bonus, a rebate, some incentive, or otherwise, we would have to disclose that in writing to our client. And that's what this is saying. If there's a bonus or something that pops up, you will allow us to take it, but we will disclose it to you in writing before you make or accept an offer to purchase. That's what this little additional compensation piece is. Now, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Can you go over that second paragraph? Something about VA loan. What is that?
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. I did say I was going to say that again. We're not there yet, folks. In the financing chapter, we're going to talk about different loan types, and some of them are what we call government-backed loans. A VA loan is a loan that is backed by the Department of Veteran Affairs. It is for military spouses, military, retired military, people who have served and have not been dishonorably discharged. The way that the VA underwriting and laws exist, the VA buyer is prohibited from paying the buyer compensation out of pocket. So that is a whole thing in and of itself in the real world. If they're not offering compensation to a buyer's agent and your buyer is utilizing a VA loan, the question is, where are you getting paid from? Because the buyer cannot pay you directly with a VA loan. It's not allowed. That's what that means.
Would that be the seller, as you said, like if it's, no? Because it says,
If the seller's not offering you money, we would look to the buyer. But if they're a VA buyer, we can't look to the buyer, is what it's saying. It would be illegal for us to ask the buyer to pay us. It'd be illegal for the buyer to pay us because the VA doesn't allow it, as the law is currently set.
So, for example, just so I understand, let's say Dan Ryan Builders, right, is new construction happening. They, of course, they're the seller, right? And I find a buyer. That buyer is VA loan. Wouldn't Dan Ryan owe me that commission?
You have to understand, it's entirely up to the seller if they want to offer that compensation. We advertise this. Remember on the listing agreement, you know, if Dan Ryan Builders is the seller, they probably have a broker and employee representing them, and they probably will offer compensation to a buyer's agent. But this only kicks in if they're not offering us compensation. So if you're helping somebody buy a Dan Ryan home and they say, I'm offering you nothing, this is where you would probably look to the buyer and say, pay me. But if it's a VA loan, they can't pay you. It would be prohibited. Does that make sense? Yeah. So speaking of builders, that'll answer Jacob's question as well. Josh's question. I just saw Jacob and Josh side by side in the chat. Josh's question, it's not uncommon for builders to offer incentives when they got a lot of inventory that they're sitting on for a while and they're ending their year end. You know, there's builders, my buddy just did one where they offered him 2.5% commission and then a $10,000 buyer agent bonus. So he made both. Well, he probably put 2.5% on this agreement. And so what this is saying is he's entitled to get that $10,000 on top of the 2.5%, but he needed to disclose it in writing to his client prior to them making or accepting an offer. Does that make sense?
Yeah, we do stuff like that all the time.
Builders do it all the time. Justin says, I wonder if this is why my broker tried to push me towards a different loan. Justin, are you military? Yeah. The reason why he tried to push you towards a different loan, depending on when you tried to buy, and folks, I hate to say this, most sellers don't like VA loans. The reason they don't like VA loans is because there's more restrictions imposed on the seller to do certain repairs. The property has to be in a certain condition because the government's got skin in the game. So if you had an offer from a conventional loan and a VA loan and the terms are the exact same, they're going to pick the conventional loan every single time because VA loans have more restrictions and more requirements on the seller and, you know, more harsh appraisal process. That's probably why, not because of the commission.
It was a new bill, so I'm confused. That's why, like, now I feel like, did I get bamboozled?
Well, you know, and everybody always feels that way in this class because you have these aha moments if you've ever purchased real estate before. Most new construction offers compensation, though. So, I've never, unless it was in, like, the height of the market and it was Lennar, they were notorious for not sharing any. Was it a Lennar builder or a Lennar home? Yeah, I'm not going to say anything. I'm not allowed to say anything. But yeah, they went through a phase of not trying to pay any real estate brokers during the height of the market. But most of the other builders knew that the market would shift again and we would remember things, right? So, yeah, just out of curiosity, Justin, what builder was it? Do you remember who the builder was for your community?
So I'm going to tell you what happened. We actually bought our house. This guy actually built this house for himself. It was a custom build. He ended up going and buying a brand new car and the financing fell through. So we went on the contract the first day it was on the market. So I'm not sure who the builder is. I just know his name is Robert.
So it wasn't like a semi-national or big builder. It was like a one-off build?
Well, he basically built our whole neighborhood, but I don't even remember the name of the company, but it wasn't something that was known.
Okay, yeah. And so, it is a little more common for smaller builders to not offer the same type of compensation. Yeah. What area are you in?
I'm in Garner, 27529. I'm off of Bryan Road in Everwood.
In Everwood, okay. I probably would know the builder. I would just have to look. Yeah, I don't know. Who knows, right? This is why on the day one I said, don't worry about what happened to you, what you know, what you don't know, what you've experienced. Just focus on the words for the test, right? That's the best way to tackle this. So here's where the when you've earned your compensation is triggered differently, right? On the other one, it was like, okay, well, if they sell it or agree to sell it, if you procured a ready, willing, and able buyer, if you close on the property, those kinds of things. This one changes. The compensation shall be deemed earned under any of the following circumstances. If during the term of this agreement, buyer, any assignee of the buyer, or any person/legal entity acting on behalf of buyer, directly or indirectly enters into an agreement to purchase, option, and/or exchange any property of the type described above, regardless of the manner in which the buyer was introduced to the property. So in other words, if they have signed this agreement with us and they get under contract to buy a house, with or without our help, they owe us our commission. It's kind of a big one. If they get under contract to buy a piece of property with or without our help, we've done our job. What you got, Jacob?
Okay, so lots of times, right, working in new build, people will come in for the first couple times without a realtor. But we pay, right, obviously, since it's a new builder, like within our own firm, we get paid a percentage, but then we also pay the buyer's agent their portion of the commission. But if they don't, it usually, not always, but usually if they're not there for the first 1 or 2 important visits, the realtor, we won't pay them that. So does that mean if they, if the buyer's agent sign this, then, and we're not going to pay it, then the buyer is now responsible for paying their agent their compensation?
That's exactly what it means. Legally speaking, so everybody understand that Jacob's talking, this is actually, he's right. New construction, a lot of them have adopted a policy where if you are not, and it sounds like yours is better than some, because some of them are ruthless, where like they won't let you come in, even though they may not have signed anything, they won't let you come in. If they walked in without you, some of them are ruthless and they're like, we're not going to pay anybody anything. But so the policy is if they come in and they get under contract without their agent present, that, some builders will say, well, we're not going to compensate an agent now because they weren't here at the beginning. And that's what Jacob's talking about. And so the question is, if this buyer agency agreement is already in place and they get in there and they get under contract without their agent present and the builder is refusing to pay the agent, is the buyer legally responsible for paying us? The answer is yes, because they got under contract without us. Now, this next one is just like the other one. It's that extender, the extender clause, also called the protection period. And what was the other name I told you this was called?
Is that due diligence?
No, not there yet. That's a sales contract thing. What's it called? Protection period, extender clause.
Is it the writer?
No. Tail clause. Tail. Because it's on the tail end of the agreement. When the agreement ends, this kicks in. So if within blank number of days you try to enter into an agreement to buy a property that we introduced you to, you could be liable for paying us our compensation. And then the last one is, if having entered into an enforceable contract to acquire property during the term of this agreement, if the buyer defaults under the term of that contract, we could still potentially be due our commission as well. Now, it does state, I want to point out something to you here. This is why, to Jacob's point, this is so important. When you look down here at the buyer's duties, I just wanted to show you this. It says, buyer agrees to cooperate with firm in the acquisition of real property of the type described in paragraph 1, including but not limited to, working exclusively with the firm during the term of this agreement, immediately referring to firm information about any properties the buyer may have interest in examining, complying with reasonable requests of the firm to supply any pertinent financial or personal data needed, being available for reasonable periods of time, examining properties only by appointments made by or through the firm, and accompanied by an agent. So this is the problem, right? If they're going in there without us after signing this, they're in breach of this. They're like, hey, Dingleberry, we said include us. Don't go into a house without us because you said that we were going to represent you. So that kind of goes hand in hand with what we're just talking about. Now, let me back up again. There is nothing else too crazy in the beginning pieces. Just remember, we're never making guarantees in these. If we're dealing with a listing agreement, we're going to put forth our best efforts to get your home sold. And if we're dealing with this, we're going to put forth our best efforts to help you buy a home and get you the best price and all that jazz. So that's where it talks about the duties. Here's that non-discrimination provision again. We just looked at the buyer's duties. Dual agency looks almost identical to the listing agreement. There's nothing else really super pressing. That's all it kind of in a nutshell for the actual agreements. Now, folks, understand that there is a non-exclusive buyer agency agreement. Oral buyer agency agreements are always non-exclusive and open-ended. But there is such a thing as a non-exclusive written buyer agency agreement, which is basically where we say, yeah, you can have other people. Here you go. Non-exclusive buyer agency agreement. It's not going to be nearly as testable, but you have to understand it just means we're not restricting you to only work with us. Non-exclusive. So, I mean, if you're helping somebody buy, an investment property, but they're working with other agents to buy other investment properties, you might use this. If you wanted to make it property specific, say, well, okay, you're entering into an agreement with us for this one house, but you can have an agreement with anybody else for another house. So it is a thing to have a non-exclusive buyer agency agreement in writing, just as there is that exclusive one in writing. And then, of course, oral buyer agency agreements are always non-exclusive. Okay, and open-ended, no period of time on the oral buyer agency agreements. That being said, folks, go take a break. Come back at 7:25, and we'll keep on keeping on. So we just looked at an exclusive buyer agency agreement and kind of touched on some of the different provisions within there. And of course, I told you we are going to talk about how much money we make on it. And then we're going to say, okay, we're going to look to get that from the cooperating brokerage firm, right? The listing firm or the seller directly. And if they're not going to pay us, then we may look for the buyer. We already talked about the retainer and success fee a little bit. I want to talk about this little note at the bottom. It says all affiliated brokers must be paid by their supervising BIC. Now, in general, this is true regardless of if we're talking about national or state. The money goes to the firm, and then the firm pays the affiliated licensees. And we're going to kind of talk about the way that kind of flows in just a moment. But I will provide some clarity. Understand that it is okay for people to be paid directly as sole proprietors. It's just if you are affiliated with a firm, all money would go through the firm, and then your firm would pay you. That's kind of how it goes. Because remember, the firm is the agent, not the individual licensee. So, as we're talking about this, I told you that the compensation, well, actually, let me tell you something about the compensation, folks. We talked about statuses. And the only statuses in North Carolina that you are legally entitled to do brokerage activity with and be entitled to compensation with are active and current status. If you're not on active and current status, then you should not be doing any brokerage. If you were, you would be doing illegal brokerage, which would mean you were not entitled to any compensation. So you are only entitled to compensation if you are doing active and current brokerage. If your license ever becomes inactive or expired, you cannot use it. You must cease and desist all brokerage activities. To the extent, folks, let me just give you an example here, okay? If you had a deal that you were working on and it was set to close in 3 days, and your license went inactive 3 days before closing, if you go to closing, you have done illegal brokerage activity and you have forfeit your entire commission. You are not lawfully allowed to take it anymore. Now, if you go inactive, your firm could have somebody else go to closing in your stead because everybody in your firm is a sub-agent. And so your firm would still have done it lawfully and your firm would be entitled to compensation. Now, one last note on this, and we'll talk more about this in a later section, but the rules in North Carolina state that you can actually be paid, this is important, don't get this mucked up in your head, that you can actually be paid if your license is on inactive or expired status, so long as you never did illegal brokerage activity, and so long as you're only being paid for things you did while you were current and active. What do I mean? If your license goes inactive 3 days before your closing is set to happen, they assign somebody else from your firm to finish it. The firm gets paid. Your firm could turn around and pay you your split because you didn't do any illegal brokerage activity. Does that make sense for everybody? That is a North Carolina specific thing, not a national thing. Every state kind of looks at some of those things differently. So I'm going to ask you a question to make sure you're understanding everything. And now there's a little bit of an advanced concept in here, but hopefully you can kind of follow along with me with this question. So here's the question. True or false, Bobby Broker of Go Realty has procured a ready, willing, and able buyer at full price for a listing you have in Governor's Club. However, the seller is unable to deliver title in a reasonable time. Per the exclusive right to sell listing agreement, you have earned your commission.
True.
True.
Everybody nodding? Everybody feeling good about true? Yeah. You have procured a ready, willing, and able buyer at terms acceptable to the seller, and the seller cannot go forward with it because of a title defect, but that does not change the fact that you did your job. The seller may be in breach, but you are still entitled to your compensation. So, I've already talked about a lot of these, and I told you I'm not going to pull up all of these again. We've already mentioned them, but I can't impress upon you enough. You have to be very thoughtful on your test taking about the differentiation between these documents. And I told you, no matter what we're talking about, you always need to think about the parties. So let's just do this game real quick just because it's so important on the test. Who are the parties to a listing agreement?
The sellers are the agent.
And the agent is who?
I'm sorry, the agent.
The firm.
Yeah, the firm. The default is the firm, right? But yeah, the seller and the agent, and the default for the agent is the firm unless we state otherwise. Okay, buyer agency agreement. Who are the parties?
The buyer.
And the firm.
There you go. The buyer and the firm, at least the buyer and the agent, and the firm is the default agent unless we say that it's a sole proprietor or otherwise. How about this one? This one, we've talked about, but you haven't necessarily seen this terminology on the screen yet. Contract to procure a tenant. What do you think that means?
I think that would be the property management. Where to go? The property management, as well as the representing the realtor for the property management or the firm thereof.
Yeah, there you go. Let's just expand on that a little bit, but y'all are on to it here. Folks, this is very similar to a property management agreement. However, all that this is the parties are the property owner and the firm, but all they've hired you to do is find them a tenant. They don't want you to manage their property, but you're still working for the property owner as the firm to just find them a tenant. So it's called a contract to procure tenant. The property management agreement, same thing. It is the property owner and the property manager firm, which would make in a property management agreement, what would that make tenants if we were talking about a property management agreement? Customers. There you go. And then,
Principal.
say what?
Or principal, right?
No.
Principal and client.
Principal and client are the same.
Oh, yeah.
We're talking about customers. The tenants are customers. There's people we don't care about except for honesty, fairness, and material facts. That's the only thing we owe those people. And then the employment contract between you and your firm, that independent contractor agreement. And so all of these form different types of relationships. Now, told you, listing agreements have to be in writing from the offset. Property management agreements have to be in writing from the offset. All agency agreements have to be in writing from the offset except for buyer agency. Buyer agency agreements specifically can be oral to begin with. And remember, oral buyer agency agreements are non-exclusive and open-ended. You cannot bind them to work with just you, and there's no period of time. They can cancel any time. Told you it's like dating. Now, in that oral buyer agency agreement, I told you that you would need at least oral consent to act as a dual agent, because even oral buyer agency agreements are express. There's that word again. What does express mean?
Stated.
Stated. Stated. We've discussed the terms. What does this relationship look like? That's all express means. Okay, stated. Now, earlier I talked about the things that our written agency agreements had to have in North Carolina. There you go. Has to have the signatures of all the parties, have to have the individual broker's license number, have to have the definite termination date, and have to contain the non-discrimination provision.
Can you stay on the screen for just a second?
Yeah, for sure. All of the above. Now here's where I'll just, while you're, taking these notes, I'll just go off on, a little bit of a tangent here, folks. There are so many different concepts that seem exceptionally similar and in reality kind of are similar in a lot of ways. But yet again, you have to be able to differentiate them. Agency contracts and sales contracts are different. But we've got all kinds of other contracts as well, right? Leases are contracts. Promissory notes that we get into the financing are contracts. And so there are certain contracts to do certain things, just like a listing agreement is between a seller and the agent. Buyer agency agreement is between the buyer and the agent. And well, same thing. Sellers, sales contracts do different things than some of these agency contracts. So you've always got to pay very careful attention. And I'm going to make the joke again because I've seen it too many times. Folks, there are sometimes questions as straightforward as what document would outline the relationship between a seller of real property and the person representing them, the price that they intend to list it for, and, all the terms of the agreement. Well, that'd be a listing agreement, right? Between seller and the person representing them, that'd be a listing agreement. And I can't tell you how often students will pick something like buyer agency agreement. This is why I'm trying to beat it in your heads. Relationships matter. You've got to know who the parties are. You got to know what the document is intended to do and everything in between. Everybody good with that statement?
Yes. You did say earlier, though, this is quite little side note, include broker's real estate license number. That is not the firm, right?
Correct.
That is the individual agent.
Correct. The individual licensee. Ironically enough, even though the firm is the agent, ironically enough in North Carolina, the written rule requirement is the actual broker who signs it. But we do put both on there, but the rule doesn't require both. So, go ahead.
It's not necessary simply because the license will be held in the broker's office.
Yeah, I mean, that's presumably what it is, that, by default, we know which firm is going to be a part of this because the firm is the agent, but we want to know who's actually the one who signed this to make sure that they were in compliance, because at the end of the day, a firm can't sign anything. Only the people who work on behalf of the firm can sign stuff because, the firm's not a person, even though we may treat them as such. So here's where I'm just going to, we've already looked at these slides, okay? I skipped forward because I wanted you to see these before we kind of had some of the discussions that we already had. So we've already talked about the open listing agreement, the exclusive agency, the exclusive right to sell, and we recapped that as we started class. So hopefully you are feeling okay with these. Here's a little visual, although I don't know that it necessarily helps you. Ultimately, it's just understanding when we would be entitled to compensation. But a word of caution, sometimes the test questions will use terminologies like exclusive agency listing agreement, but then the question has nothing to do with that. So just be careful because they will try to trick you in that regard, kind of like when we talked about taxation, and it'll give you the city and the county, but then it's outside of the city limits. Sometimes you got to know that certain information is not important to the scenario. Now, there's a couple other things that you need to be aware of while we talk about, agency contracts. While they're not agency contracts per se, they are testable in their own right, kind of as a similar categorization. So let's start with the first one. This one is called a protection agreement. For whatever reason, The North Carolina Real Estate Commission likes to call this a protection agreement. What the actual name of it is in North Carolina is the Unrepresented Seller Disclosure and Fee Agreement. So I want you to think back to being a buyer's agent. Well, you probably want to get paid as a buyer's agent, don't you? Sure. And so if you have a buyer client, which you will at some point in your careers, I'm sure, who wants to see a for sale by owner, what are you probably going to ask this for sale by owner to do?
There is no one
Compensate you.
Compensate you. That's exactly right. Folks, you said on a buyer agency agreement, we expect to make this amount, and it said we're going to seek it from who? The seller or the seller's agent. So if you're calling it for sale by owner where there is no agent, you're probably going to ask the seller, hey, I've got a buyer client interested in your property. Would you compensate me if I help them buy your house? And sometimes they'll say yes, and sometimes they'll say no. Now, we're going to focus on if they say yes. If they say yes, folks, are you just going to rely on a handshake for that seller to promise to pay you? No, that would be stupid. So we have this protection agreement. It is actually legally in North Carolina called the Unrepresented Seller Disclosure and Fee Agreement. So it's where, remember, we would have already disclosed agency status when for the seller. If we're a buyer, an agent talking to a seller, when did we disclose agency status?
Initial contact.
Initial contact. And so now that we've gone over the agency with them, and we go to show this house and we want them to pay us, what this protection agreement does is it reiterates, hey, remember, we don't work for you. Even though we may provide you forms, even though we may facilitate this agreement, we work for the buyer, but nonetheless, you have agreed to compensate us as the buyer's agent. So that is why it's called a protection agreement. It protects us from liability of them not understanding who we represent, and it protects us to get paid because they promised to pay us. So we need a written document. If you ever see the term protection agreement, this is what it's talking about. The Unrepresented Seller Disclosure and Fee Agreement.
Quick question.
Mm-hmm.
In the exam, let's say we ask this in the exam, would we see it would be under both a represented seller agreement or NC protection agreement?
I would wager that you're more likely to see protection agreement on the North Carolina side, but let me show you why. Let me see here. Working with real WWREA is working with real estate, agents. The disclosure, agency disclosure. WWREA working with real estate agents.
I got a question.
Yeah.
Does the agreement protect you if the buyer decide to go around your back and go directly to the for sale by owner? If the for sale by owner decide to say, "Hey, we're not going to compensate you."
The buyer agency agreement is, remember, that extended clause, that protection period, that tail clause, or if they get under contract with any property during the terms of our buyer agency agreement, they owe us a commission, remember? So this agreement wouldn't protect us from them doing that, but the buyer agency agreement automatically protects us from them doing that.
Okay.
Yep. I don't know why this isn't working. I'll pull it up in a second. I don't want to spend too much time hunting for this. But what I was trying to show you was the syllabus. On the pre-licensing syllabus, they very clearly identify it as the protection agreement. For whatever reason in that section, they will call it that, even though that's not the legal terminology for it. So.
And when is this brought for? When is this brought for?
Um,
Like when do we need to? When does this need to be signed?
prior to making an offer. Yeah, prior to making an offer. I was going to pick on you, Josh. I'm like, sometimes I think you're so intently taking notes that you miss some of the things I say. I'm like, I thought I said that. But this would be when the seller has agreed to compensate us as a buyer's agent when they're acting as a for sale by owner. When would you need this signed before you make an offer? Because you don't want to get under contract and then ask them to pay you. So you would say, okay, well, hey, I'm going to send an offer. Do you agree to pay me? So you would get this protection agreement signed before you send that offer over on behalf of your buyer.
Can you give me a hypothetical situation, little story in which this occurs?
Sure. Jacob, you call me up. You want to buy a house. I say, great. Let's enter into a buyer agency agreement. So I'm representing you. It's exclusive. You can't have anybody else. You're looking through Zillow one day and you find 6 homes you like. One of them is a for sale by owner. Because of my fiduciary duties, I have to take you to go see that house if you want to go see it. But because it's a for sale by owner, they have not initially offered me any compensation. So before I take you to go see that property, I'm going to call this for sale by owner and I'm going to say, hey, I'm a buyer's agent already representing my buyer client, Jacob, so that I've disclosed it initially. And I'm going to say, Jacob's interested in your house. Can we see it? And they say yes, and we'll schedule an appointment. And then furthermore, I'll say, okay, well, if Jacob's interested in putting in an offer, will you agree to compensate me 2.4% as an agent who brought you a buyer? And they say yes. I say, great. I'm going to go see the house, and if he likes it, I will send you this protection agreement to sign, confirming that you understand that I don't work for you, I work for Jacob, and that you are agreeing that you are going to pay me 2.4% as we discussed at the time of closing for bringing you a buyer. Done.
Wonderful. That made everything feel so much more clear.
There you go.
One question. Would you ever use this agreement if you're in the exact same scenario, or actually no, never mind. Dumb question. My bad.
Sometimes when you start to like play it out in your head, you answer your questions, don't you? Because you're like, oh wait, no, you would just use this, right? Yeah. There you go. There you go. I will pull up the syllabus on your next break. I just don't want to spend too much time hunting for it while I'm trying to get through some of these other topics. Let's talk about this one, folks. When we're dealing with those listing agreements, these buyer agency agreements, these are what we would call typically full service agreements, meaning we're going to do anything and everything within the scope of our authority and the law to help you fulfill your cause, right? Sell your house, help you buy a house. We're not going to break the laws, but we're going to do all these different things. And of course, we have all these laws and rules we have to abide by. Well, there is such a thing as what we call a limited service broker. So a limited service broker is a broker who would endeavor to do certain aspects of the business for you, but maybe not do everything. And so when we're dealing with this, please understand that we could sign an agreement that limits the things we're going to do, right? The services we're going to provide. But we are not ever allowed to limit our duties under license law or commission rule. So the most common scenarios here is what we call a cafeteria style or an a la carte style, where maybe the sellers would say, okay, well, or the agent would say, for $500, I'll measure your house. For $300, I'll do a CMA for you. For, $500, I'll put it in the multiple listing service for you. But please understand, while you may be limiting your services, you cannot legally limit your duties, like those requirements to present all offers. So you may say, well, I'm not going to negotiate offers for you. Well, somebody sends you one, you would still have to forward it legally. If somebody needed to know material facts, or somebody you were talking to, you would still have to legally disclose material facts. You can never limit your legal obligations or duties under license law or commission rule, but you could, in theory, limit your services on what you were or were not going to do for them, what they have contracted you to do for them. Now, this isn't going to make too much sense yet, but it's coming up in just a second. Be cautious of the term discount broker. Probably more of a real-world thing to be aware of. But we don't like to call them discount brokers because we're going to talk about some very important legislation that's testable in just a second called antitrust laws. So saying discount could imply a violation of antitrust laws. So, let me ask you a question. Make sure you're still feeling good about some of these different concepts I've thrown at you, as we do, just to help you with your understanding. So here's the question. And remember, you have copies of all these slides, so like, don't come at me, bro, if you didn't get enough time to take all these notes, because you know we got a lot of stuff to still cover. So I'm just trying to, you know, you've got this all in writing. I understand that notes are great and all, but you've got recordings and you've got, you know, all of these things. So here's the question. True or false, a seller is moving to Alaska and will not be back to North Carolina once they move in 3 weeks. Therefore, they would like to sign an exclusive right to sell listing agreement with Go Realty that does not terminate until the house is sold. Is this allowable under these unique circumstances?
No. It must have a date. Definite date.
There you go, Dora. That's the next question was going to be the why, folks. Doesn't matter that there's unique circumstances. It has to have a definite termination date. Could you put it for a year? Sure. Could you put it for 2 years? Sure. But it has to have an end date. You cannot leave it open-ended. That is not lawful in any way, shape, and form on written agency agreements. So no, this would not be okay.
So question, it doesn't matter, right? It has nothing to do with whether they move to wherever they want to move. It's just because of that date. Correct?
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
No special circumstances will ever change the legal capacity that you cannot have an open-ended written contract. Yep.
That one threw me off. I was trying to read over all the Alaska crap and figuring out why that was relevant.
It's not. It's not. So that's where you gotta know what you know, right? Sometimes they're gonna throw extra crap in there, but you gotta know what you know. Oh no, it has to have a definite termination date. Doesn't matter anything of the other aspects. So just a side note here, because sometimes you get these curveball questions. Speaking of which, is they're going to ask you some questions about, you know, oh, what would definitely be in a listing agreement? Folks, they're going to ask you all kinds of crazy stuff potentially. Like, what would have to be in a listing agreement? Well, there is nothing stating that square footage has to be in the listing agreement. There is nothing stating that, you know, we have to measure the house before we take a listing. There is nothing guaranteeing a sale. There is no, there's just a lot of things that aren't in there. So use some common sense in there. You know, a lot of times we have these listing agreements and then we go out and we find some of the details. Are we potentially going to measure the house for you? Sure. But that's not something that's in the listing agreement. Okay. It's not required there. It's part of our duties sometimes. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. But all it is an employment contract. It is them hiring us to represent them and be their person. It talks about whether or not we can do dual agency. It talks about us putting forth our best efforts. It talks about when we're entitled to compensation. All of these different things, okay? But there are certain things that they will try to trick you to make you think that it's going to be in there. They're not. So a couple more notes here. Of course, this is just stating, you know, some of the things we've already talked about when we looked at the listing agreement. The next set of things on the next slide are continuing this thought. And so before I switch slides, I'll go ahead and tell you, because I know some of you are still taking notes, and I'm going to try to drag for time and give you some time here, but at the end of the day, I got to get through this stuff. The agency contract is the place we talk about monies that we are entitled to. Point blank, period. That is the only place in North Carolina that we should be discussing how much money we're going to make as a real estate licensee. And the reason why I'm telling you that is because you could get questions, and we have a rule, which is Rule 58A.0112, which is a sales contract rule that states that you can use, as a licensed real estate broker, you can use, and we're going to talk more about this, you can use any pre-printed sales contract that's been drafted by an attorney, so long as it contains 19 required provisions that the rule requires to be in there, and so long as it does not contain 2 prohibited provisions that the rule says cannot be in there. One of the prohibited things that you cannot talk about in a sales contract is broker compensation. Folks, who are the parties to a sales contract?
The seller and the firm.
Sales contract.
Oh, sorry.
Buyer and the seller. And so we are not a party to that contract. Why would we talk about our money on there? We may help fill this contract out. We may negotiate this contract, but ultimately, this is what I'm telling you, it's so important to realize the parties. We're not a party to the sales contract, so we shouldn't be talking about our money on there. We talk about our money on the agency contracts. Now, I'll go ahead and tell you the other prohibited provision, and we're going to get into it in a little bit, is no disclaimer of liability. Yet again, you can't plug in anything on the sales contract that says you hold us harmless if we screw up. Nope. You are held liable if you screw up. You've got to know what you're doing as a real estate broker. So, never talk about our commissions. We talk about them, we never talk about our commissions on the sales contract. We only talk about them on these agency contracts, right? Listing agreements, buyer agency agreements, property management agreements. Agency contracts is where we talk about how much money we're going to make. And as I told you, they could be flat rates, they could be percentages, they could be, miscellaneous ways that it's addressed on there. So here's where we'll get into the math side of this, because I think it was Adriana or somebody asked a question earlier about, okay, well, how does this look? And I said, we're going to get there. And I will remind you that a lot of the math concepts basically fit the same mold. I would say that 80% of our math in this class is percentages. 80%. And this is no different. So when we say a 6% commission as the gross commission, well, that means the listing firm as a whole is charging 6%. So let me just kind of bring my calculator in here and flow through this with you. So we had a sales price of $189,000 and we said we were charging a 6% commission, $11,340. Now, the hardest part about this math is not the percentages. It's following the flow of information, because what you'll get sometimes is very lengthy word problems. Home was sold for this. The listing firm charged 6%. They offered 2.4% to a cooperating selling firm. That selling firm had a split with their firm, or the selling licensee had a split with their firm of 70-30. So let me just give you a little bit of insight. When we're talking about splits, we're naming the big categories as listing firm, selling firm. Understand that this is a math question. We don't care where this person's loyalties reside. It's not important here. All we know is that they're entitled to being paid because they brought the buyer. Is everybody okay with that statement? In a question where loyalties matter, we need more information. But if all we're asking you to do is calculate who got what, it doesn't matter whether they were a buyer's agent or the seller sub-agent. They were just entitled to this portion of compensation. So the listing side works with the seller. The selling side brought the buyer. Doesn't matter where their loyalties are. Everybody cool with that statement? So sometimes we talk about percentages of percentages, and sometimes we talk about the percentage of the sales price. So this 6% is a percentage of the sales price. Well, that 6% then goes on to be split as a 60-40 split. That is a percentage of a percentage. So that's actually the same as saying that the listing firm got 3.6% and the selling firm got 2.4%. Because if you take the 6 and multiply it by 60%, you get 3.6%. So there's a couple of different ways you could tackle this. And so my recommendation, if you've got these math problems, is what I like to call a commission tree. So let's say that you had a scenario, and we'll just use the numbers on here, but then it goes a little bit further, and it says, okay, well, the individual licensee who works for the selling firm has an 80-30 split. And this is how it would be, kind of referenced. It's going to say 80/30. And so what this means is, of the gross amount that came to the selling firm as a whole, the individual licensee who did the deal will get 80%. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I'm drunk over here, apparently. I'm like making up numbers. 80-20 is what I meant to do. The individual licensee would get 80%. That's what the first number is. And then the firm would keep 20%. So let me just show you what this would flow through in a commission tree if this was a word problem. And of course this isn't. But so you would say, okay, well, the gross commission of 6% is $11,340. So we start there. Of that, we'll call this the listing side, the selling side. You've got the $68.04 going here. and the 4536 going here. But then we took it a step further and we said, okay, the individual licensee over here gets 80% and the firm keeps 20. And so as you break it down, it should all kind of extrapolate back up. So our 4536 times our 80%. If the question was, how much did the individual licensee on the seller's firm make? It would be $3,628.80. And so this amount plus this amount should equal that amount. That amount plus that amount should equal that amount. It's called a commission tree, and it helps you kind of track your work. You got the listing side, you got the selling side, and it helps keep it straight, because the biggest mistake that people make is they don't know who the hell they're calculating for. So if they don't keep it straight, they'll be like, oh, well, you know, the listing firm, because it will give you extra information. It'll tell you something like the listing broker has a, 60-40 split with their firm, and then the buyer's agent has an 80-20 split with their firm. How much did the, selling broker make? And you've got to be able to just break it down piece by piece. But all it is percentages. Let me give you a real quick example of this. Just while we've got the math out, so you can see what I mean. Yeah, Jacob, just keep this to yourself. Sometimes we don't need to know the way that some people work on these, right?
My philosophy is, as long as you get the right answer, I don't care how you get it.
That's exactly right.
I used to tell the kids that at school, because I used to get so frustrated because teachers would say, well, you've got to show step by step. If you can figure it out in your head and give me the right answer, because when you're tested, don't nobody care how you got the answer. All they want to know is if you got the right answer.
Facts.
I don't care how you got it, Jacob. As long as it works for you and you know what you're doing, it works.
Yeah, that's why this Common Core bullcrap is so stupid. I'm like, why are you going to dumbify math and make people show work for unnecessary steps?
Yeah, and it's absolutely
exactly.
Stupid.
I'm a very left-brain person, and so like in math class, whenever a teacher would tell me how to
show your work,
it made me want to roundhouse kick him in the jaw.
He does want.
I got in trouble in AP Calculus because my teacher was like, you have to put everything down. And I was like, but I know the answer, so why do I have to take and spend 5 sheets of paper writing the steps if I can give you the answer?
That's exactly right. It doesn't make no sense.
I don't got time for all of that.
Same.
Nobody got time for that.
That's right. Ain't nobody got time for that. That's right. That's a classic. Folks, here's exactly what I'm talking about, okay? I'm not going to make you do all of them. You've got these packets available to you. I think I need to post some of these videos. I've got them recorded, but of course, editing time eludes me. But take a look at this one, okay? Actually, better yet, I'm going to save that one. Let me scroll up and see if this other one's good. Is this one?
That was easy.
Yeah, that one's too easy. Let me show you one, and then I will let you do the other one. So
there is one on the homework that I was doing today,
mm-hmm.
and it was tricky.
Here we go. Let's do this one together, and I'll show you how to work it out, and then I'll give you one just to see that you are good, okay? So house sales for $200,000 at a 6% commission. There is a 50-50 split between the listing firm and the selling firm. The listing agent has a 50-50 split with his firm, and the selling agent has a 60-40 split with his firm. How much will each agent make once the sale closes? Now, of course, this is just a practice question. This is not a multiple choice, so we're asking for multiple answers. On the test, we will only ever ask for one, but this is where I told you that commission tree comes into handy. Comes in handy. My brain is, I'm just like, we've got so much to cover. My brain's just moving way too fast. And I'm just like, oh, I'm going to scream at you and make up words. So let's start with the beginning. Okay. Sold for $200,000 times your 6%. Now remember what I told you. It's just like thinking 6% would be in the calculator like 6 cents. But you can also come in here and you let the calculator do it for you. 200,000 times 6, hit the percent button, $12,000. So there's your gross commission up at the top. So then it goes on to say, let me move my calculator out of the way, 50-50 split between the listing firm and the selling firm. Okay, well, you can do times 0.5 or you can divide by 2. Hopefully we all understand that's the same thing. So listing firm,
It's 6.
selling firm, $6,000, $6,000. Notice how it adds up to equal our gross, so we're good so far. And then it goes on. The listing agent has a 50-50 split with his firm. Let's stop there. We're on the listing side. So we've got $6,000 to the listing side, divide by 2 again. So that means the individual broker made $3,000 and the firm kept $3,000. Notice how that adds up. Our math looks good. So this is a 50-50 split. Now, the numbers don't really matter. 50-50, it's either way. But when you see something like this next one we're about to do, the first number is the agent, the individual licensee. So the selling agent has a 60-40 split with his firm. So now you've got to take that $6,000 on the other side that's going to the selling firm, multiply it by 60% to get the individual broker's portion. So the broker made $3,600 and the firm got everything else. Now in this particular question, it doesn't really matter because we want to know what the brokers made. Listing broker made $3,000, selling broker made $3,600. If we wanted to finish it out, it would be $2,400, and of course it would all extrapolate up. What you got, Sam?
So my question before, as soon as I read the question was, is the first number or the second number the brokers? Is that always the case?
Always the case. Always the case. The first number is always the broker. And then the second number is the brokerage firm. Yeah, it's called a commission tree. So it is, it just helps you keep it straight. You got to have sides and you got to have, the pieces. This is the biggest place is not the math where people mess up. It's following along with who is who by name. And the biggest mistake is that selling side. Folks, it doesn't matter whether they're a buyer's agent or a seller sub-agent. The listing firm works for the seller. So the other firm is the only other firm we care about here, and it doesn't matter who represents who. It's all about math. So you're feeling pretty comfortable? You think you can tackle one for me real quick? So let's go back down to the multiple choice one. I'll make it easy on you. Number 2 right here. Because this one's got some interesting numbers in there. Knock that one out for me. What you got, Jacob?
So I just saw in the comment somebody talking about the tree. This is a trick I learned in high school that I think is super helpful for like word math problems. And people saying that they get confused or whatever. What I have always done is I read the last sentence first so I know what it is that it's asking me. That way I can really kind of know what it is that I'm paying attention to and what matters and what's irrelevant and what's not. That just helps me.
Yeah, I love that. And I kind of alluded to something similar. Now, I said read the entire question, then reread the last line, and then reread the question. But I mean, just as easily you could do it that way, read the question. It's very important to know what you're actually answering. Now, folks, I'm going to tell you this. When we get into some of the more difficult math concepts, I do have tricks I can show you. But of course, it's going to depend on how comfortable you are with, the basic math concepts in and of themselves. But, when we get to net to seller math in a little bit, I can make that super easy on you. I got a lot of tricks.
What's up with kids?
Say what?
Tricks are for kids. Tricks are for kids.
I say it one more time.
I'm just making a joke. I said tricks are for kids.
Oh, tricks are for kids. I'm sorry. Your microphone, because like you unmuted and then started talking, your microphone wasn't catching the first word that you said. Yeah,
Gotcha.
Monica, tricks are for making this class easier. Okay, I got you, girl. We're gonna make it so much easier for some of these math concepts.
I love it.
Yeah, that's right. Tricks are for kids. They are.
That was the rabbit. I used to tell my sons that when they were younger. That's interesting.
Yeah. It was the old Tricks commercial. That's right. Silly rabbit. Tricks are for kids. That's right. Folks.
Do you guys remember, like, way back?
Oh, you muted back. You can say it.
It's irrelevant. I was just saying, do you guys remember way back when they took, like, a vote on whether or not the rabbit was ever going to actually get to eat the tricks for the commercial?
Yeah, I remember that.
Big commercial.
Yeah, no, it was like it was a big old like marketing ploy. Yeah. Will he ever actually get them? That's right. Folks, let's go through it. Okay. I'm just going to take it piece by piece. Help you out here. Okay. As Jacob said a little bit ago, what you're ultimately answering, how much will Sam make in commission once the property closes? Now, don't focus only on Sam, because sometimes it's good to keep all the information straight, but that's ultimately what you are answering. So we got John, an agent with West Coast Realty, list a home for $370. Then we got Sam, an agent with East Coast Realty. Okay, so we got two different brokerage firms who has the buyer for the property, and they go under contract for $350. Now, first things first. When we're dealing with commission, it is what it actually sells for. This list price is irrelevant. That just means it was marketed for that. But ultimately, the sales price is $350. So that's the first big thing to understand. So then it goes on to say there's a 6% commission. Okay, well, let's just start there with the math. So we've got the sales price of $350 times your 6% gross commission for $21,000. Okay. Then it goes on, the co-broke split, meaning two different firms. This firm's getting 50%, this firm's getting 50%. So yet again, divided by 2 or times 0.5. Say what, Corey?
Wouldn't that be 10-5 on the split between both firms?
Yep, there you go. So now, do your tree here.
It's simple, affordable, and
Oh, wait, no. Tim, did you mean to unmute? Were you going to ask something?
your goals with JP. No, I'm sorry.
No worries.
Chase mobile app.
So, the gross... there we go. I'm going to give it a second to make sure everybody's muted before I explain this any further. You can always unmute and ask questions. Okay, Tim, I don't know what you keep doing. You keep unmuting. You're muted right now, Tim. Don't unmute. Unless you've got something to say. You just unmuted 3 times in a row. I muted you, then you'd unmute. I'm just trying to help everybody out here. Everybody's muted. And like I said, you can always ask questions, but if you accidentally unmute, I just mute you back. So, gross commission is $21,000, and there is a 50-50 split. So the listing side is $10,500. And it really doesn't matter what you call it, but let's just call it the selling side. Even though we know they're a buyer's agent, they are the selling side. So they also got $10,500. Now, as it goes on, John has a 55-45 split. Honestly, we don't care. Don't make extra work for yourself. We're not looking for John. We're looking for Sam. So then Sam has a 62-38 split with East Coast Realty. Now, really and truthfully, as long as you do this math right, you can't get this one wrong. Why? Because even if you go to the wrong side, the number's the same. But let's just make sure that we understand who Sam is. John listed the home. So John is over on this side. Sam is over on this side. He's the selling agent, okay? So we'll just call it what it is. And so of the $10,500 that's going to the selling firm, Sam has a 62-38 split. So he gets 62% of that $10,500. So times 62% would give us $6,510. Everybody feeling okay? It's just bite-sized pieces, step by step, figuring out what information is important, making sure you keep the numbers. Folks, remember on the test, and I would suggest during class 2, you are allowed scrap paper. Sometimes the best thing to do to keep your minds right, draw it out. Just like I'm showing you, draw it out. Don't make silly mistakes because you think you can do it in your head. I think I'm as fast as I was in my early 20s. I'm not, okay? It's not a good idea for me to attempt to do that. I will break something. Although on that note, my 7-year-old thought that he was faster than me, and I had to put him in his place yesterday. So fortunately, I didn't break anything. So he had to learn a lesson. How are we feeling? Everybody okay on this?
Yeah.
Now, of course, all of these math concepts have a more difficult version. And so there is a version of this where we have what we call variable commission rates. And so let me just give you a quick example of that. But you've got a lot of these to practice, and you can always ask me questions, and I will post some more videos to help you understand these math concepts. I just don't want to spend the most time here because it's such a minutely testable thing in the grand scheme of things. 7 questions out of 140. How to think about that with the way it changed.
When you say that, you're talking about our test to pass the class, not the actual...
No, the state licensing exam to get your license only has 7 math questions.
Oh.
So, Jacob, think of it this way. If you miss all 7 questions and get the rest of it right, you pass.
Yeah, you would.
I'm not banking on that.
Well, I wouldn't bank on that either. But it is possible to pass missing every single math question. Now, of course, all the math is on the national, so that's 7 out of 80, but it's still less than 10%, you know? So let me just explain the variable commission rate really quick, and then, y'all can practice some more of these on your own time. Let me try to find some blank space here. Sometimes we deal with commercial. Now, this is where I'm just like Jacob and I had the conversation earlier. This may not make sense to you, but it does make sense to somebody. When we're dealing with commercial deals, folks, sometimes commercial institutions have way more money than they should. And so we don't know exactly what something will go for sometimes for a commercial deal. And so we may have something like a listing agreement that states that if we sell it, anything up to $5 million, we would make 6%. And then anything from $5 million to $8 million, I'm going to stop putting all these zeros, but I just want you to, we would make, 8%. And then anything in excess of 8 million, we would make 12% or something like that. This is just bracketed commission. So let's say that you had this agreement and you sold a property for, $12.5 million. So, yeah, it happens all the time. So what you have to understand is you have to do this in brackets. We know that you have exceeded every single one of these metrics. So for the first 5 million, that was at 6%. So basically you're saying, okay, well, we sold it for, I'll just put sales price, $12 million. And so what you would do is you would take that 5 million and multiply it by your 6%. So you made a $300,000 commission within that tier. And then anything between 5 million and 8 million, well, folks, that's $3 million. Everybody understand that? What falls in between 5 and 8 mil is in this bracket. So you would take not 8 million, you're not double dipping. You got 6% on the first 5 million. The 5 to 8 above that, which is 3 million, would be paid out at an 8%. So in that bracket, you made $240,000. And then everything in excess of 8, you made 12%. Well, you made 4 million more than 8 million. So now in that last bracket between 8 mil and 12 mil is another $4 million, and you're getting 12% on that. So times 0.12, $480,000. In this scenario, you made all of this combined as the listing agent. Now, this is not a very prevalent type of math problem, but could you see a differentiating commission rate? Yes. It's just important to understand the brackets. You're not double dipping, okay? You're not getting it on all of it. It's this much up to this point, this much between here and here, and then this much above that.
So you made $1,020,000 or 20.
Did you add it all up? 480,000 plus 240,000. Oops, too many zeros. Plus 300,000. Yep, you would make $1,020,000. That'd be a good payday, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I don't.
It does
I
happen.
think it's a commercial property.
It does happen. Now, the thing is, you probably paid like $400,000 to market that property, so, you know, but that's still a good payday.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Real good.
It's still a good payday. Right.
When you used to be a teacher, that's
I'll take 0.5%. That'd be nice. Just the 0.5 on $1 million, you know? Yeah.
Ooh.
So lots of different things to practice, but I'm telling you, the biggest thing within these is just keeping the parties straight, making sure you understand listing firm versus selling firm and who is representing whom, and being good with percentages. And I told you, if you're not good with percentages, practice them. Math is universal. It does not matter where you go, who you look at. You can watch my videos, you can watch any other videos. Math is math is math. Okay? There may be different methodologies to teach it versus like the T-bar and the way that I like to do linear equations, but math is math. At least it wasn't until Common Core. But, you know, whatever. Any big questions or concerns about this math before we move on into other things?
okay, Jacob.
Yeah. Just not even going to dignify that with a response. I'm just going to like, I like math because math doesn't lie. Okay, English lies. I before E except after C. Nope, there's like 52 exceptions to that. English lies. All right.
I checked out when numbers and letters became friends.
Yeah. Algebra is great. Anything above that sucks. But you know, algebra is cool. Ain't no need for trig.
Differential of equation.
Say what?
So don't go into differential of equation.
No, we don't need that kind of negativity in our lives. So let me bring something else into the mix, folks, and I want you to understand something. Do not consider this that I'm about to tell you a listing agreement. This is a concept that's going to be testable in the same kind of vein, but it's not, you know, in the same categories as your open versus exclusive agency versus exclusive right to sell. A net listing is, well, folks, first and foremost, what does net mean for your paycheck? Let's just go there. What does net mean?
What'd you bring home after taxes? After
taxes, expenses, you know, deductions, whatever. Your take home. So a net. Say what?
I said everybody would rather have their gross.
Oh yeah, for sure. That'd be better. Well, the good news is when you become a real estate agent, you do get your gross, but then you have to pay your own taxes out of it. So that's the big problem. So let's talk about this net listing. Just like the word net means after expenses. A net listing is a type of listing where we have agreed that our compensation is not going to be 6%, 5%, 4%. What it's basically going to be is the seller says they need to make a certain amount of money. And so anything that we can sell it for in excess of what they need to make, we're going to take. That is a net listing. So it is not a listing agreement in and of itself, but it is a portion of it that says our compensation is based off anything in excess of what they said they need to sell it for. Now understand, a net listing is not illegal. However, Because of our fiduciary duties and obligations and our obligations to look after people, there is a high risk of impropriety in using a net listing, but it is not illegal. So let me give you two examples of when it would be legal and when it would be illegal or a problem. If I was helping somebody list a house and I wasn't sure if we could sell it for enough money for them to pay off their debts, get out from under it, and pay me what I needed to make, I may agree to do it out of the kindness of my heart for whatever I could get. So let's say that they needed to make $120,000 to pay off, the bank. And I think I can maybe sell it for like $125,000, where I would normally charge them, $8,000. I may only make, $4,000 or $5,000. So I might sign a net listing to say, well, I'll take anything I can get in excess of that. No problem, right? Because I'm doing it to help them out and I'm basically charging them less. That would be a very okay use of a net listing. Now, if a seller said, well, I just want to get out from under this house and they owe $200,000, but I know I could sell their house for $500,000 and I didn't tell them, and I got them to sign a net listing, sold their house for $500,000 and pocketed $300,000, I'm in trouble.
Illegal.
There you go. So, well, yeah, it would not look good. We'll say that. So understand that difference. A net listing is not illegal, but it's highly discouraged due to the potential for abuse and fraud and not looking after people, and you could get yourself in trouble. So if you see a net listing, it is just taking anything in excess of what the seller says they need to make. That's all it is. That being said, go take a break. Come back at 8:40. Whoop, whoop. So we just left off talking about a net listing, and I told you don't confuse that with a type of listing agreement. It is not a specific listing agreement. It is just a compensation type that can be utilized, and I told you it is where you are basically taking anything in excess of the minimum amount that the seller says they need to get. Not outright illegal, but definitely has the potential for some impropriety if not utilized correctly. So as we keep going talking about some of these different concepts that kind of overlap with the agency and agreement section, it's going to kind of go a couple of different places. And let me give one last mention on some of the things that you've already heard me say, just to make sure you understand it before I move on to a different direction. I keep talking about the MLS. Okay, that is how we as real estate brokers, from a brokerage practice point of view, market properties to the most buyers. It stands for multiple listing service. So when we take a listing, we will, get photographs of that home, details of that home, and we will market that home, sometimes through social media, print advertising, and then this is one of the biggest ways that we market houses, is the multiple listing service. And that multiple listing service is how things end up getting on Zillow as well. So for you consumers right now who are not licensed, if you go look on things like Zillow or Realtor.com, there is what we call an IDX feed, which basically takes the information that we put into the MLS and then funnels it out to these different sources. But you don't see everything that we see. There is places for what we call agent remarks, and the compensation that's offered. So this is where we would see these other listings. We would see what the offer of compensation was, and then we would agree to co-broker a deal together based on the information therein. Listing firm offers to a cooperating buyer's firm. Buyer's firm brings the buyer. We agree to work together to get it to closing. Although representation is exclusive and separate, we're going to compensate each other and work together. So even though it's not necessarily an agency contract, there are some other big things that we need to talk about from an agency point of view. And so this is really the best place to kind of bring them in, for lack of a better place to plug them. And so I mentioned this first one a little bit ago. It's what we call antitrust laws. Okay, this is your introduction to some big testable pieces of legislation. So antitrust laws stem from what's called the Sherman Antitrust Act. That's what it's called, Sherman Antitrust Act. These are the same grouping of laws that do not allow monopolies. If you're not familiar with monopoly outside of the game, it is basically where one company holds all the rights to a specific trade or business. There's no competition. That's not allowed. We are a free market, open enterprise kind of, government. And so the idea is competition keeps prices in line. because you could get charged one thing from one person and then something lesser or more from another person. And so the fact that you have competition helps us keep prices where they, kind of meet the market demand. This capitalist kind of outlook. So let me tell you what is prohibited under these antitrust laws. The big things that you're going to see terminology-wise, and I'm going to give you visuals for these, but let me explain them, is price fixing, boycotting, and allocation of markets. All of these are very, very illegal. And so let me just give you a real estate example of this. I want you to picture that the head honcho from a Coldwell Banker, Keller Williams, Century 21, and Allen Tate, whoever, meet up one day. And they say, hey, listen, we're all out here doing real estate brokerage in this given market. Why don't we all unanimously agree that we will all charge 7% on commissions? And that will allow us all to make more money because there will never be a cheaper option out there. That would constitute price fixing, and that is highly illegal. Let's say at that same meeting, they say, well, while we're at it, let's all agree that we will stop allowing ABC Mom and Pop Realty down the road to show our listings and we won't show theirs, and they'll eventually go out of business. That would be boycotting. That is highly illegal. And then the last one is not as easy or not as, fathomable, but it's where you allocate markets. And so let's say in that same meeting, they say, okay, well, let's just go ahead and get out of each other's way. You get this zip code, I'll get 27553, you get 27604, and we'll just kind of stay out of each other's hair. And then that way, there's even less competition. That is called group allocation of markets. That is also highly illegal. Now, I always like to ask the question to see what you folks come up with, but do you think these meetings are actually happening?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think so. All the time.
They're not. They're not. They're not. It's funny because there's always, I've been teaching this for years, and every single time I ask that question, there is half the class absolutely they're doing this, and the other half are I don't really think so. They're not, folks. Why? We're in competition. Why would we collude together to do these types of things? But it's friendly competition. But here's the thing. You still need to know what these different terminologies mean, and let me explain how you could actually see this on a test and how you can get yourself in trouble from a real estate brokerage point of view. I want you to think about this, okay? Josh calls me up, and Josh says, Seth, I want you to sell my house. I say, you got it, Josh. So I meet Josh at his house, and we go over the different things I'm going to do as his listing agent, and my firm's going to do. And then we get to the big question. Well, Josh says, well, Seth, how much are you going to charge me to do all these things? And I said, well, Josh, me and my firm, we're going to charge you 6%. And here's what Josh says. He says, 6%? That's crack prices, Seth. Lord have mercy. You want my left kidney? You want my firstborn child? My God, that is ridiculously high. And so then I look back at Josh and I say, well, Josh, listen, that's what everybody charges. That's enough to be guilty of price fixing. Because if I say that's what everybody charges, the implication is that I met with everybody and we agreed to charge that. So you have to understand that we never say anything like that's the going rate, that's the customary rate, that is what everybody charges. It's okay for our firm to charge something. Because if I say, Josh, that's what my firm charges, I'm okay. Why? Because can't he just pick up the phone and call a different firm who may quote him a different price? This is what you got to be careful on the test. You cannot say that's the going rate, that's the customary rate, that's what all firms charge. Now, let me ask you the other question in regard to boycotting. Have you ever heard anybody complain about maybe not enjoying their lender, right? They used a lender and they didn't do a good job for them. They weren't communicative. They don't think anybody should use that lender. That would be boycotting. If a broker or somebody goes out and says, don't anybody ever use ABC Lending Company because they're the worst and they never responded to my emails and we almost lost the deal, that would be boycotting. So are these things happening from a legal point of view, violations of this law point of view? Sure. But are they happening in the most blatant of ways? No. Absolutely not. So this is all part of the Sherman antitrust laws. And so under these antitrust laws, price fixing, boycotting, and allocation of markets are highly illegal. Folks, there are severe penalties for this. There is fines up to hundreds of thousands of dollars and jail time for violating these things. They don't mess around. So price fix, you go ahead.
The key word is group price fixing, right? Because individuals might be doing this, but collectively it's not.
Say that one more time.
So group pricing really, like group, the word group, because I'm noticing that's in every single one of these.
Yeah.
Really the key.
Businesses in competition with each other colluding to do this.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. It's okay for us to say, well, that's what I as a licensee charge. But now be careful, Kirsten, because now that, I mean, let me just make sure you understand something. Don't ever just blatantly say that, you know, any type of price fixing is okay. The generalization that you need to approach any question with is that prices are always negotiable. Whether we elect to negotiate or not is up to us. But they are always negotiable. We wouldn't say have a fixed rate. We would say this is the rate we charge. And, you know, but you still have to look at it as, are these negotiable? Yeah, they can attempt to negotiate with us, but we don't have to negotiate. We could say no. Now, I want to point out another big thing here because a lot of people get tripped up on this on the test. And I don't know if you're going to get test questions like this, but just so we're on the same page. Folks, there is nothing stating that if we give one person a deal, we have to give the rest of the world a deal. That's not the case. So could I say, you know, Josh, I'll help you out and I'll do it for 5% for you. And then I do it for 5% for Josh. And then Sam calls me and I charge Sam 6%. I've done nothing wrong. We are allowed to charge whatever we want to charge, whatever all the parties agree to. We do not have to offer everybody the same rate as a real estate professional. So don't get that tripped up on the test. Whether it's a property manager company. Okay, yeah. Josh says that there is a lawsuit where they're going after property management companies for price fixing. And they go after them hard. If they can prove it and there's been any kind of discussions like this, they will. They will go after them hard. There are severe penalties for this. Now, I'm going to say this again. This is all part of the antitrust laws. Why is this? Why do I keep saying this? Because you're going to get introduced to some other laws that come into play later, like fair housing laws and, you know, solicitation laws. And you got to kind of keep them separate in your mind. So antitrust laws deal with, you know, the illegalities of price fixing, boycotting, and allocation of markets. All of these are highly illegal. What you got, Justin?
You said this. Never mind. I see it right now. Never mind.
The illegal part or the allocation of markets part? I just switched the slides on you, so that was the next slide.
No, I was going to ask you, was this under the Sherman Act, but I see it now.
Yeah, the Sherman Antitrust Act. That's exactly right. So sometimes we just blanket call it antitrust laws, but it's under the Sherman Antitrust Act is the actual name of the legislation that enacted these.
Is that what it will say on the test, or will it bounce between the two?
They will bounce between the two. If it says antitrust laws, it's this. If it says the Sherman Antitrust Act, it's this. Yeah, they're mean like that. That's why I told you there's so many AKA, also known as, right? You got to know all of them because they could throw them interchangeably. So, as I said before, your firm can have a set price, but for general blanketed questions, you know, just read into it. If you have a question that says, is it okay for a firm to say we charge 6% and we're not willing to negotiate? Yeah, that's okay. If you have a question that says overall, what is the understanding of, you know, commission rates? They are negotiable. Everybody's welcome to attempt to negotiate with us. Doesn't mean that we have to negotiate. So here's just what I said here, okay? Firms set their own rates. This is what I charge. This is what my firm charges. That's okay. Are we willing to negotiate? If we say no, that's fine. But in general, think these are negotiable. And as I said before, just because we charge one person, 5% does not mean we have to charge everybody 5%. There's nothing stopping us from charging the next person 7, nothing stopping us from charging the next person 4. It is on a case-by-case basis, and that's okay.
I'm pretty sure one of the questions on our, I think it's on the final, because I went ahead and,
The practice final?
yeah, God help us. But I think one of the questions on there is this specifically.
Mm-hmm. There you go. So here's where I said that you got to keep this straight. Everything that we're talking about here, Sherman Antitrust Act, also called antitrust laws, deal with boycotting, price fixing, and allocation of markets. Well, now we're switching gears. I'm going to go ahead and talk about some other laws that you need to be aware of, okay? So let's just group these together and let's call these solicitation laws. Folks, what is solicitation?
Advertisement.
You reaching out to possible clients.
There you go. Advertisement, reaching out to potential clients, that is solicitation. Folks, when you get your license as a real estate broker, of course you've got to activate it. Of course you've got to get it where you can use it. And after you get it where you can use it, what is going to be the most important thing with your license to do?
Advertise that you have one.
More specifically, find people.
Business.
There you go. Find business. And that's how you do it, right, Jacob? You've got to advertise. You've got to tell the world. Folks, nobody is just going to come knocking at your door and be like, I heard you got a broker's license. Can you help me buy a house? That's not going to happen. Nobody cares. You've got to go out and convince some schmucks that you're the person to work with to help them buy or sell real estate. And the way that you do that, you've got to be careful because there are solicitation laws. And if you break them, you can get in trouble. So let's talk about these. Remember when we were discussing the differentiation between the term agent, broker, and realtor. An agent is somebody who represents other people. A broker is somebody who gets a broker's license. In this case, a real estate broker is getting a real estate broker's license. And then a realtor is a person who joins a trade organization called the National Association of Realtors. When you join that trade organization, there is what we call a code of ethics that you agree to abide by. There are articles within, and you're basically saying, I promise to adhere to these things. And one grouping of them specifically deals with how we interact with other realtors. Specifically, Article 16 says, do not try to steal business from other realtors. Respect exclusive agreements that other people have. If you try to steal business from other people, you could be in violation of the Realtor Code of Ethics, which could bar you from being a realtor. Or it could also constitute what we call tortious interference of a contract, tort law, civil lawsuits. If you help somebody break a contract in order to work with you, that party could sue you for damages. So you don't want to try to steal business from other real estate professionals. Now, in regard to the rest of these, though, folks, let me give you a big word of advice. And yet again, it's going to sound like I'm joking. It's going to sound like I'm poking fun, but I've been teaching for a while, and I've seen students make these silly mistakes on the test. The rest of the things that I'm going to tell you, there is a big clue as to what they deal with in the name. Let me give you a hint. If I talk about do not call legislation, what type of solicitation do you think that deals with?
Phone calls.
Phone calls. Makes sense to me. If I say the CAN Spam Act, what does that word spam make you think of? Email. Yes, spam email. Every single one of you has a spam email folder. The CAN Spam Act deals with email solicitation. And if I was to say the Junk Fax, F-A-X, Fax Prevention Act, What type of solicitation do you think that deals with?
Fax machine.
A fax machine. You know, that thing Jacob has never seen in his life.
I actually used one for the first time last year.
I was waiting for a story like that. I was just picking on you because you're young. For the first time, that's right, last year. I didn't even know they still operated. People still have landlines nowadays?
I have one in my
what?
office here.
Yeah. I was about to explain it to you too. Like a what? I do have one at my house here in Georgia just because my signal's not great because I have a metal roof. So sometimes just in case I need it. But, folks, the reason I'm telling you this, it seems silly, right? But I can't tell you yet again how often I have seen students answer questions on do not call legislation and they'll answer as the Can Spam Act. It's in the name, right? Swear to God, it's in the name. So let's talk about the do not call legislation a little bit more, okay? With the do not call legislation, folks, I'm going to give you kind of the abridged version of this because I need to keep rocking and rolling through the material. Once upon a time, somebody picked up the phone, they made a phone call, or here's what they decided. If we call enough idiots, some idiots will say yes to whatever it is we're selling. And they were right. So they called 1,000 idiots and got 100 sales. And when that happened, they're like, oh my God, this is great. It's a numbers game. The more calls we make, the more business we'll get. And then everybody started doing that. And then nobody wanted a phone anymore. And so one day they said, okay, enough is enough because, I'm sure some senator got a phone call and that's what it took to get this legislation. They said, okay, let's put some restrictions on this. So the do not call legislation basically created a do not call list. So you can put your number on the do not call list. And if your number is on there, nobody should be calling you to solicit your business. Do they do it anyway? Yes, but that's not the point on the test. So the do not call list, you should be checking it every 30 days. Why is this important to us as real estate professionals? Folks, people do cold calling. If you're calling random numbers to ask them if they want to buy or sell, and you call somebody on the do not call list, you are in violation of the do not call laws. Hate to break it to you. Nobody wants to hear from real estate agents any more than they want to hear from the extended car warranty people. We're the same. The health insurance people, we're the same. So if you're making phone calls to try to solicit business, you need to check the database. Because if you call somebody who's on the do not call list, you are subject to big old penalties. Now, the most testable thing on this is going to be the exemptions. Understanding when you can't call them, when their name is on the do not call list in general, versus the exemptions, times that you could call them, even if they're on the do not call list. So the exemptions, I'm just going to name them and then I'll give you some more slides here that will hopefully help depending on which version of my slides I'm currently using. If you have a business relationship with them within the past 18 months, in other words, I helped them buy a house or sell a house. Even if they're on the do not call registry, I can call them if that transaction has happened within 18 months. Okay, that's a big one. So understand that 18 months or less is okay. So if you get a question of, well, I helped them sell a house 12 months ago, can I call them even though they're on the do not call list? Yes, I can. If I helped them sell a house 20 months ago, can I call them? No, I can't. And not if they're on the do not call list. So business relationship within the past 18 months. That's an exemption. You can call them even if their name is on the do not call list. Or if they've done a direct inquiry on one of your business sites within the past 3 months. They basically filled out a form and gave you their contact information within the past 3 months. Then you could call them even if they are on the do not call list. The other exemptions, personal invitation. If somebody tells you it's okay to call them, you can call them, but you would need to maintain record of that invitation. Personal relationship is also acceptable. Your brother, your sister, your girlfriend's best friends, sisters, nieces, nephews, cousin. If you've got some type of relationship with this person, you can call them. Now, let me go into a little more of the abstract things that you could be tested on. One of the big things that pops up here is a for sale by owner. Understand that a for sale by owner is not an exemption. But listen to me. You can call a for sale by owner to solicit their listing if they are not on the do not call list. If they've never registered their number, you can call them. That's the point. Sometimes people forget that. They focus on these exemptions and don't realize that, they never register their number. You can always call them. They're not going to like it, but you can. Does that statement make sense for everybody? If they have not registered with the do not call list, you can always call them and solicit. Now, let's say a for sale by owner has registered their number on the do not call list. You can call them if and only if you have a buyer client interested in that seller's property, because that's not solicitation. You're trying to bring them a buyer. And it is very specific that you should not try to solicit their listing on the phone, because then you're still in violation of the do not call list. Now, violations of this are accompanied with penalties. On a federal level, they can go up to $11,000 per violation. And on a state level, they can range anywhere from $500 to $5,000, depending on the frequency, the amount of violations in a subsequent period of time, and anything in between. Do not call list.
How does a person go ahead and go put their phone number on a do not call list? I want to do that.
Yeah, well, here's the thing. Don't count on it to work. It's funny. As a real estate agent, I'm like, I don't want my number on a do not call list. But then I realized my clients are never going to check that list, so they will still call me. So I put my name on the list like 2 years ago. I swear I have more spam phone calls now than I did before. But the thing is, there are attorneys that you can hire to go after these people if you can find them, and you can get fat checks that they have to pay as fines if you can find them. There are attorneys that make their entire living this way. But good luck trying to find them, because one day they call you from Bucharest, the next day they're in Budapest.
I love the ones where they call you from your own phone number.
Isn't that great?
Never had that, but I've had an exponential amount of spam phone calls pick up recently. It's bad. It's to the point where, like last week, I think that I was probably getting close to 50 or 60 a day.
You put your number somewhere you probably weren't supposed to, because that's a lot.
No, but I didn't. I don't know what it was, but I
think at this point, Jacob, just get a new phone number. That's going to be your best bet.
Genuinely thinking about it.
Right. But to answer your question, you can just Google through the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, and the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. You can just Google the do not call list and you can register. There, it'll prompt you. It's a government website. Yeah. So let's go to the next one, okay? The CAN-SPAM Act, folks, it is actually a very funny name. Look at this. It is called the Controlling the Assault of Non-Solicited Pornography and its Mail or Marketing Act, depending on who you ask. And so you have to understand, before Jacob was born, the internet was a wild thing, right? Back in the day when email was new, every single email was some kind of pornographic image or them trying to sell you something weird. Like, would you like some pills that'll make your something bigger than something? The internet was a wild place when it first started. Okay. It's not just the cat videos that it's kind of evolved into. And so because we all had these email addresses where we're just getting bombarded with these emails, same thing, legislation was passed that basically restricted the way that this works. Now, here's the thing. This deals with mass emails. Why is this important to real estate brokers? We send out just listed emails, just sold emails, weekly newsletters. All of these would fall into the criteria of mass emails if we're sending them out to 100 past clients. So here's the rule. You can email these people in large groups, but it has to contain a conspicuous opt-out or unsubscribe notice. If you look at like your emails from Target that you get on a weekly basis, look at the bottom. Click here to unsubscribe. Or click here to be removed from our mailing list. That's the requirement. And once they unsubscribe, you need to stop emailing them. That is the CAN-SPAM Act. That's why it's called a spam folder. It came into play after the CAN-SPAM Act. So the other one, I will just give you a quick honorable mention. The Junk Fax Prevention Act basically says that if you are sending any solicitations by way of a fax machine, it would have to contain instructions on how to stop receiving those advertisements. Now, a fax machine is where you send data and it prints out a page. So what that would basically look like is text or fax a cover page to this number with the words opt out written across it. It would just have to contain instructions on how to stop receiving the fax messages. I don't think there's a slide for the Junk Fax Prevention Act because it's just such a quick little mention. But these are all dealing with solicitation laws. Okay, solicitation laws. So let me make sure some of the things I've just thrown at you are still good in your head. Okay, here's a little question for you. Not about necessarily these. This is about the commissions again. Oops. Firm usually seeks a 6% commission to list properties for sale. A potential new client does not wish to pay that percentage. What can the firm do here?
They can say it's non-negotiable.
They could, but
Option number 2.
yeah, within the confines of the choices I'm giving you.
They can negotiate if they want to.
Yeah, they can negotiate if they want to. Understand that 1 and 3 are not going to be considerations because I told you you don't have to take a listing, but it's not because it's unfair to other clients. It's because maybe it's just not a good fit for you. And then the number 3 says allow the lower commission as long as future listings also meet that. No, I told you we don't have to just set a price and then it has to go forever and ever. That's not a thing. So. We can freely negotiate for this person, charge this person this much, charge the next person a different rate. That's okay.
So, Seth, I want to make sure I was unmuted. Okay. So, is it, there's no set commission in everywhere or just in North Carolina?
Everywhere.
So, there's no set commission. So, that would be like on either part.
There you go. Sherman Antitrust Act and the solicitation laws, national concepts. National concepts. Everybody is bound by those. Just like the Lead-Based Paint Hazard Reduction Act, national concepts. Some of this legislation is national.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's just kind of in the same light, because there's not a great place to talk about it. Of course, this really, what I'm telling you now, kind of falls into the closing a transaction or, kind of the brokerage business aspect, not so much listing contracts. But when we're working with a seller, there are certain things that we expect the seller to provide to us. For instance, a copy of the deed. We need the deed to make sure that they are currently the owner of record. I told you, North Carolina, while it's not required from a broad point of view for a deed to be recorded to be valid, we don't consider you the owner unless you have recorded it for all intents and purposes. So that's how you protect your interest. So we need to see the deed to make sure you are the current grantee, shows that you're presumably the owner of record. Copy of the survey. Remember, a survey is done by a licensed surveyor. Could show you any encroachments, easements, public right-of-way access, setback lines, anything like that, the size of the lot. Copy of any restrictive covenants, which are what type of land use control? Protective covenants, also called restrictive covenants, are
Encumbrance.
they are an encumbrance, but they are a what type of land use control?
Oh, land use control. Land use control. Private.
Private land use control, rules imposed by the previous property owner on future private property owners. These deed restrictions, these protective covenants are private land use controls, not to be confused with the governmental, which is the public land use controls. And then, of course, the other thing we need from them is their payoff statement. Why? Because we need to know that what we're going to sell it for is enough to pay off all their debts, satisfy all those liens so they can convey clear title, and so that we can be paid as well. It's kind of important.
Seth, is there ever a time where what they want to sell it for is under what they owe? And what do you do in that situation?
That what they want to sell it for is oh yeah. So Kirsten's question is there ever time that what we could sell it for is less than what they owe? Yeah, that's called a short sale. And so a short sale, we'll talk a little bit about the financing section. A short sale would be where you go to the bank and you say, hey, listen, I'm trying to sell this. I don't think I can sell it for what I owe to you. Now, if you had the cash in the bank, you could just pay the bank the difference and just walk away scot-free. Or you could walk away and let them foreclose upon you, or you could go to the bank and ask them to facilitate a short sale, which is basically where you jump through some hoops and the bank might give you permission to sell it for less than what you owe them. Why? Because it's sometimes the lesser of two evils between a foreclosure for a lot of different reasons. It doesn't mean you're walking away scot-free, but it's still better than a foreclosure on your record. But they still could come after you for what's called a deficiency judgment, which is where they try to get their money some other way from you, from your personal assets, as opposed to that specific lien that was on the property. But that would be a short sale. It does happen. Jacob, is that sincerity or sarcasm? I didn't hear you, huh?
I said I'm actually so serious.
Yeah. Honestly, there's a lot of really good information that may help you all in your personal lives that I can teach you in the finance section. So it is good. It hurts your brain, but it's really good information. Of course, folks, if we're talking to a seller, let me ask you this. A lot of people get confused and they think that, okay, well, you're talking to a potential buyer and they start talking about what they could buy. Oh no, for substantial contact. Now we got to give them the working with the real estate agent's disclosure. But think about it for a seller point of view. If you're sitting at somebody's kitchen table talking about listing their property and they start telling you what their balance is and why they're selling, have we had first substantial contact? Absolutely we have. So make sure that you are, very aware that you would still have to go over the working with the real estate agent's disclosure with them in that regard as well.